Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The world has a way of remembering what it needs to, even when memory gets buried under dust and progress. So when the Wayfarer choir faded from the tongues of men and turned to rumor, the song itself never stopped wandering. It drifted through radio static, trembled through electric wires, rode the hum of generators in quiet towns. Every time a human hand reached for warmth instead of wealth, the song found new breath. Centuries turned slow. The world grew taller, faster, louder. Machines learned to think, but not to feel. Skies filled with lights that weren't stars, and men filled their heads with numbers that weren't truths. Somewhere beneath all that shimmer and noise, the hum still waited. Quiet, patient. The same tone that once rose from drift-marked glass and Bridge Hollow Forge. It had outlasted names, nations, and even the notion of forever. In a rust-gray city that stretched clear to the horizon, a woman named Clara ran a repair shop. It wasn't much a cramped place stacked with broken drones, half-dead lamps, and the hum of flickering fluorescents. But people came from far off just to watch her work. Not because she was the best, though she was, but somehow when she fixed something, it stayed fixed. Lights shone a little warmer, engines ran a little quieter. Radios that hadn't worked in years started playing faint music. The ghost remembering how to smile, she didn't know why. Her father used to tell her stories, those stories of warmth, of bells that sang, of wanderers who carried light with their bare hands. She'd laugh saying, "That's old world poetry, Pop," but when he passed, she found a small bronze shard in his toolbox. Smooth on one side, cracked down the middle, and humming faint but constant. She kept it on her workbench. Every time she touched it, she felt something stir in her, not like a thought, but a memory older than blood. So she built around it. A coil here, a resonator there, not by blueprint or reason, but by instinct. Weeks turned into months, and when she was done, she had no name for what she'd made, a small orb of brass and glass, soft lit from within, humming low like a heart at rest. She called it Echo One. When she first powered it on, the lights in the district flickered, then steadied brighter, cleaner. Folks came by that night asking what she'd done. Clara just smiled. "I fixed the hum," she said. Word spread. People brought her old relics, devices from aboard the New Age, all buzz and static. She'd touch them, listen a while, then tap a wrench or tune a dial, and every seal one, no matter how dead, would start humming again. But it wasn't just the machines. People began changing too. The tired started singing in the streets again. Neighbors shared food instead of fear. Children laughed in places that hadn't heard laughter in decades. Clara Little Shop became the heart of the city, not a cathedral, not a market, but a forge of kindness. And then came the day the hum went silent. It was just after dawn. The skies turned strange, not storm dark, but empty. The sound that lived between sounds vanished. The city stopped breathing. Clara ran to her workbench. The shard had gone cold. She tried everything, rewiring, striking, praying. Nothing. For 3 days, the silence stayed. People began panicking, thinking the warmth had finally left for good. Clara didn't speak. She just sat there, staring at that little bronze piece until tears streaked the grease on her cheeks. On the 4th night, rain came. Not soft and merciful like it used to be, but heavy, pounding, like the heavens themselves were trying to remember rhythm. Clara stepped outside, soaked to the bone, the shard in her hand. She didn't think, just listened. Through the crash of thunder, the rattle of metal, the roar of a city losing its pulse, she listened, and there it was, faint, buried beneath the storm, a sealed tone. She pressed the shard to the ground, felt it vibrate, and whispered, "You're still here." The ground answered. The tone deepened, grew, stretched through the rain. Lights blinked back to life, one by one, like stars relearning how to burn. The next morning, the shard glowed again, not bronze anymore, but clear as glass, filled with light. The people lived, speechless. Clara smiled, wiped her hands, and said, Guess it just needed someone to remember. From that day forward, her workshop became more than a repair shop. It became a residence guild. Engineers, musicians, builders, even poets came to learn how to listen. They built new machines, not to conquer, but to connect. Devices that hummed with empathy, circuits that warmed hands instead of just running code numbers. Generate later, when Clara's name was dust and her city was starlight, the hum still moved. It had passed through machines, through code, through dreams. They said sometimes if you listened through the static of deep space signals, you could hear it. The sound of humanity breathing steady through time. A tone soft as mercy, a warmth too patient to die. Somewhere across all that distance, if you quieted your heart enough, you'd swear you could still hear the elk of a voice, smoking low and kind, saying, "Keep it lit." Long after Clara time, the Resonance Guild became legend, part science, part story, part ghost. What she'd built spread across the continents, then beyond them, carried on frequencies no one fully understood. They called it the harmonic current, a stream of energy that didn't just power machines, but remembered the touch of every hand that shaped it. Ships rode between the stars, cities bloomed from mid in orbit, and even outposts on cold, empty moons thrummed with its steady hum. Yet for all that glory, mankind began to forget again, not the hum itself, but why it mattered. See, progress moves in circles. It always has. Each age builds its own tower, climbs it high, and then wonders why the wind feels lonely up there. They thought this new era the age of resonance, and yet in the heart of its brilliance, people started growing hollow once more. But not everyone forgot. On a small station called Ember Line, floating quiet above the amber clouds of a gas giant, there lived a janitor named Jalen Ward. Now, Jalen weren't no scientist nor scholar. He scrubbed decks, fixed vents, and listened to the hum of the great engines while everyone else chased data and dividends. He'd hum along sometimes, low, steady notes that blended with the ship pulse till you couldn't tell where he ended and it began. Folks laughed at him, called him the ghost tuner. He didn't mind. He said the ship liked to be talked to. One day, while cleaning out the lower maintenance decks, places long abandoned by engineers too proud to stoop, Jalen found something wed in a vent, small, dusty, and old beyond a reckoning. A bell, bronze and cracked clean through, but humming faintly still. He turned it in his hands, and the moment he touched it, the ship seemed to take a breath. Lights flickered, steadying after a second, that if it had recognized the sound. Jalen smiled. "Well now," he said softly, "you're far from home, ain't you?" He hung that bell by his bunk, right near the vent where the air whistled just enough to make it sing. From that day on, the lower decks of Ember Line became the calmest place on the whole station. When systems glitched, the hum there soothed them back to balance. When storms raged across the gas giant below, the decks stayed still. Some said Jalen had luck. He said it weren't luck, just listening. But word travels even when radio fails, and before long, scientists came down to study that bell. They ran scans, measured frequencies, tried to trace the resonance signature, mate. Their data said impossible things, that the sound waves matched no known harmonic model, that the tone carried fragments of old language, that its energy didn't decay, it was perpetual, living. They asked Jalen where he'd found it. He shrugged. "It found me," he said. They took the bell for testing anyway, lock it in a containment field. But something strange happened then. The ship systems began flickering again, this time worse. Lights pulsed erratic, engines moaned low like a beast in pain. The hum, once steady, fractured into static. Within a day, Ember Line was drifting dark through the storm belts. Jalen went to the lab, pounded on the door, shouted for them to release the bell. The scientists refused. They said the data was too important to lose, that when the power died altogether, the emergency lights burned red, oxygen levels fell, and through that suffocating quiet, Jalen heard a sound, not from the speakers, but from inside the metal itself. A whisper, patient, they're the tide. Remember. He found the release valve, tore open the containment. The bell fell into his hands, humming like a heartbeat that'd been held too long. He struck it once, just once. The sound rolled through the ship, take dawn breaking. Circuits reignited, engines caught breath, and the great vessel lights came alive in a slow gold glow. The scientists stared, Sen in awe, and in shame. Jalen stood there, water in his eyes, whispering to the ship, "There you go, sweetheart. You're all right now." After that, they didn't lock the bell away again. Jalen became the keeper of tone, a title he never asked for but wore all the same. When new recruits came aboard, he'd take them down to the lower decks, let them listen to the hum. "Ain't just power you're hearing," he'd tell them. That every soul who chose kindness over pride. Every builder who made something to last instead of something to boast. That hum, the memory of good work done right. Years later, when Jalen passed, they buried the bell with it. Some said the hum faded after that, but not for long, because every ship built after Emberline carried a fragment of his resonant signature in its code, a pattern the engineers called ward harmonics. And even centuries beyond that, long after the stars themselves began cooling, that tone remained. They say if you stand on the deck of a derelict ship floating in the void, and the light hits jet right, you could still hear it, a soft hum that feels like home, like a promise whispering through the dark. Keep it lit. And that the way it always goes. The warmth don't die, it just finds another set of hands brave enough to listen. The long road to Stillwater. They're an old story, whispered by traders and drifters whenever the rain come heavy and the whiskey burns slow, about a man named Thomas Hollow Briggs. Nobody remembers where he came from, not really. Some said he was a ranch hand from the Dakota Plains. Others swore he'd been a miner out near Silver Ridge before the earth took its due. But what folks do remember, what keeps the story alive even now, is how Hollow Briggs went from a man who'd lost everything to one who built something that outlived him, not an empire, not a monument, but a way of living that taught others what gold never could. He was loathed, Hollow, because he didn't speak much. Some said it was grief. Others said he'd just grown tired of hearing lies. When he showed up in the dusty town of Stillwater, he had nothing but a threadbare coat, a small ledger, and a tin pocket watch that didn't tick anymore. He slept in an abandoned barn on the edge of town, worked odd jobs for supper, and didn't say a word unless it was needed. But he watched, always watching. Watched the town storekeepers barter, watched the gamblers lose their week pay in the saloon, watched the blacksmith try and fail to keep his forge lit through drought and debt. Stillwater was a hard town built on the promise of a railway that never came and dreams that dried up quicker than creek water in July. Men left quicker than they arrived, and those who stayed learned to live small. But Hollow, he stayed. Didn't make sense to nobody. There wasn't gold in the hills or faith in the church, but he stayed just the same. One evening, after months of working odd shifts at the grain mill, Hollow bought something strange, a broken printing press. It was old, half rusted, left for scrap behind the post office. He hauled it out piece by piece, cleaned it up, oiled the gears, fixed the rollers. Folks thought he'd gone mad. What a quiet man need with a printer, they asked. He didn't answer. He just smiled that slow, tired smile and kept working. Weeks later, the first paper came off that press. The Stillwater Ledger, hand-bound, ink smudged, only 4 pages long. But on those pages weren't stories of outlaws or politics. No, sir, Hollow wrote about money. Not the kind that jingles or glitters, but the kind that moves. He wrote about how a man could take $1 and make it feed 10 mouths if he understood how to turn it over instead of holding it tight. Leafing next stories wrote about savings, about patience, about how greed blinds faster than whiskey blinds the eyes. And he did it in plain talk, words even the blacksmith youngest boy could understand. He left copies at the saloon, the church, the barber shop. Nobody paid him for him. Didn't need to. Folks were curious enough to read, and once they did, something started to change in Stillwater. The barkeep started writing down what he earned and what he lost each day. The blacksmith stopped taking loans from the rail barons and started trading repairs for grain instead of gold. Even the gamblers, Lord help them, started keeping track of odds instead of praying for luck. Within a year, Stillwater had what no other town in 3 counties could boast: profit without pride. Folks worked together, lent each other time and tools, helped build fences and barns without promissory notes or deceit. Hollow taught them how to trade fair, how to save before they spent, and most importantly, how to trust that honest work always pays, even if it don't pay in cash. But that wasn't the end of it. The ledger grew. Issue after issue, Hollow printed lessons he'd learned from years of hardship. Some from experience, others from watching men ruin themselves, chasing shortcuts. He wrote about debt, warning how it ain't debt the lender who owns you, it's the worry that comes with it. He wrote about patience, saying gold moves fast, but wealth walks slow. If you can't walk with it, you'll never catch it. The town took those words like gospel. When the next drought came, Stillwater didn't rake. They rationed, helped each other, and traded what they had instead of begging for what they didn't. Hollow Briggs became their quiet shepherd, not rich, not powerful, but respected in a way that outlasted dough. But even good things draw greed. When word spread that Stillwater had grown prosperous without the bank's help, a group of businessmen rode in from the city. They came with contracts, smiles sharper than razor, and promises of progress. They told Hollow they could expand the ledger, make it national, bring wealth to everyone. But when he read the fine print, he saw it for what it was, a no-no in Finn language. The deal would sell the paper sold to men who measured worth in ownership, not in impact. So Hollow refused, quietly, firmly. They didn't take kindly to that. One night they sent a fire through Stillwater. The printing press went up first. Flames chewed through paper and wood, turning months of work into smoke. Folks fought it, but by dawn the press was gone and so was Hollow. Some said he'd died in the fire. Others claimed he'd left town before it started, taking the watch and a single stack of ledgers with him. Stillwater mourned, but it didn't crumble, because Hollow lessons had already taken root. They rebuilt, slowly, smartly. The townsfolk built a new press to death, printed the next issue of the Stillwater Ledger in his honor. The headline read, "The fire took our tools, not our teaching." Years passed. The town grew. The name Hollow Briggs faded into myth, but his work didn't. His ideas spread to nearby towns, to cities, to schools. His principles shaped the first co-op banks, the early trade unions, even a few political movements that believed fairness was worth more than fame. Nobody remembered his face, but his voice stayed alive in the ink. Every time a man chose patience over pride, every time a woman saved instead of borrowing, Hollow hum, quiet and steady, lived on. Somewhere out on the old trail west of Stillwater, travelers still swear they hear the sound of a press clacking away on a windlit night. Some say it's it the wind in the grain, others know better. That's it, Hollow, still printing truths in the dark. When the story of Hollow Briggs faded from the tongues of the living, it did not fade from the rhythm of the land. The old Stillwater press, rebuilt by calloused hands and stubborn hearts, became more than a relic. It was a symbol of the kind of wealth no coin could measure. For generations, the ledger kept printing, though the names and faces behind it changed. Fathers passed it down to sons, mothers to daughters, and apprentices learned to read ink stains as if they were the handwriting of Providence itself. Each generation added its own wisdom, drawn from the grind of the times. When the railways finally came, Stillwater didn't bow to them, it partnered. Hollow philosophy had seeped too deep into their bones. Instead of letting outsiders buy their land cheap, they built their own freight syndicate, run by local hands, bound by an honor code written right into their contracts. No man took more than his due, and no man was left without work if he was willing to earn it. The wealth of Stillwater wasn't stacked in vaults. It moved like water through roots, feeding everything it touched. Decades turned to centuries, and Stillwater grew into a shining town, not grand, not glittering, but steady. It had its share of saloons and rail whistles, sure, but what it never lost was that hum, that low rhythm of fairness and patience Hollow had sown into its soil. Yet time, it always does, brought the kind of change that tests memory. The world outside grew faster. Men built engines that ran without pause, markets that moved at the speed of thought. People started talking about leverage instead of labor, credit instead of craft, and slowly that old patience Hollow taught began to feel outdated. A new generation took over. Stillwater's slick suits, quick deals, eyes too sharp for their own good. They didn't tear down the ledger right away, but they started to twist it. The articles grew shorter, the lesson simpler, the tone louder. Headline promised opportunity instead of honesty. They printed stock tips, not stories. And for a while it worked. Money poured in. The town new bank swelled. Folks bought cars faster than they would pay for them. The rhythm quickened like a fiddle played too hard. Pretty at first, but unsustainable. The elders warned them, you can't rush good fortune. It don't like to be chased. But the young men laughed, saying Hollow ideas were old-fashioned, relics of a slower world. Then came the crash. It started far from Stillwater, in big cities where numbers ruled men's hearts. But greed got a way of rolling downhill, and soon the banks closed, the trade lines broke, and the promises went up in smoke. Farms were abandoned, mortgages defaulted, and for the first time in 200 years, Stillwater hum went silent. When the panic hit, folks looked to the ledger the same way their grandparents once had. But what they found wasn't wisdom. The newer issues were full of noise, investment jargon, charts, predictions, and slogans that meant nothing. The town that once built itself on trust had forgotten how to listen. That when she came, a woman named Clara Briggs. She was a distant descendant, though no one knew it at first. She came from the city, wearing worn boots and carrying a sachet of books. She'd been a teacher once, then a writer, then something else entirely after the markets dipped her job and her savings in one blow. Sat on the patch. Parent walked into Stillwater one gate afternoon, rain falling close behind, and asked where she might find the ledger office. The clerk pointed to a brick build that still bore a hollow old emblem above the door, a single open hand holding a coin. She stepped inside, smelled the dust, and felt something stir deep in her bones. The press was still there. Bigger now, automated, cold. The workers stared dazed. She touched the frame like it was sacred. "Who are you, Mom?" one of them asked. "Just someone who remembers," she said. She didn't ask for permission. She just started cleaning the press herself, oiling the gears, checking the ink lines, humming under her breath like the old stories said Hollow used to do. The workers thought she was crazy, but when she turned the machine back on, the hum that filled the room wasn't mechanical. It was alive, steady, like the heartbeat of the town itself. That night, she wrote the next edition by hand. No headlines, no stock talk, no false promises.
Just a letter title to those who forgot how to wait.
It spoke of Stillwater beginnings, of hollow lessons, of the kind of wealth that can't be counted but could always be felt. She printed 200 copies and left them rumtown, the diner, the post office, the church pews, even the old saloon. By dawn, the town was reading again. Farmers showed up at the ledger door with crops to trade. Mechanics offered to fix her truck for free. Even the mayor, a man more familiar with cigars than compassion, came by to shake her hand. Stillwater found its hum again. The new ledger became a bridge between eras, half tradition, half rebirth. Clara taught young folks how to read balance sheets and how to read people. She held classes in the evenings by lamplight, teaching the same lessons her ancestor once had. You can't eat profit, but you can feed a man with purpose. When asked what gave her the right to run the paper, she'd smile and say, "I ain't running it."
Sun's eyes, einer Hinfall, man. Killing affiliated research and matching metaphor. What did we don't make a crash? Should ever refused every government stuff, every corporation deal. She said, "You can't sell what was born of trust." And she meant it. By the time she passed, the town was back to humming steady. They buried her beside the old press, and on her gravestone they carved the words she'd once printed bold across the ledger front page. "Wealth ain't the measure of what you've kept, it's the echo of what you've given." On quiet nights, when the wind moves through the wheat and the rain taps gentle on the tin roofs, folks say they can hear two presses humming in unison, one of the earth, one of the heart. At the legacy of Stillwater, of riches earned, but of patience restored. Long after Clara Briggs' name was carved in stone, Stillwater didn't endure, it thrived. Not with the blinding light of industry, nor with the fevered pace of progress that left most towns hollow and tired. Stone eyes. No, Stillwater glowed like a coal that never burned out. Warm, steady, and alive. People from across the plains began visiting, drawn by stories they half believed. Stories about a place where wealth wasn't measured in bills or banks, but in the hum of work done right and shared fair. Young entrepreneurs came seeking secrets, scholars came to study it, and drifters came to remember what honesty felt like. The town welcomed them all, but never let the world take too much. Stillwater had learned its lesson. Protect the heart even when the world hungry for it. By then, the ledger had become something more than a paper. It was a cool house, a workshop, a kind of quiet movement. The people who ran it cut themselves keepers of balance. They didn't print daily like the city presses. They printed when they had something worth saying. Each issue carried stories of people who'd built something with patience. Farmers who turned drought into harvest through cooperation, mechanics who shared their trade instead of guarding it, even children who pooled their savings to rebuild a neighbor barn. Every edition began with the same words, printed in the same plain font that Hollow had once used. We remember the hum that became Stillwater's motto. But peace has a way of attracting storms. One autumn, a group of investors came again. This time, not with paper contracts or false smiles, but with drones, data screens, and promises of smart towns. They said they could optimize Stillwater efficiency, automate its trade, and expand the ledger into the digital world. They spoke in a language half the town didn't even understand, all numbers and trends and projections. They offered millions. For the first time in a long while, Stillwater hesitated. The younger folk, bright, hopeful, ambitious, saw opportunity. They argued that Hollow himself was a reformer once, that if he'd had these tools, he'd have used them. But the elders warned, progress is fine, long and it don't cost your compass. The debate lasted months. The town hall filled every night. No shouting, no fists, just questions, fears, and long silences between the rain. Then one evening, the wind howled across the plains. A boy, no older than 16, stood up and asked something simple. Why do they want us? The room fell still. An old rancher answered, "Because we still got what they lost." That night they took a vote. The townsfolk chose not to sell. They would modernize, but on their own terms. And that decision, quieted it seemed, rippled far beyond Stillwater borders. See, the investors left angry, but the story didn't die there. Word spread about the little town that refused the machine leash. Journalists came. Philosophers wrote essays about it. Some mocked them, called Stillwater stuck in the past, but others, more honest or more tired of noise, came to learn. They walked the fields, sat by the printing press, and listened to that hum. It wasn't nostalgia they found, it was wisdom that still worked. In time, Stillwater built its own digital press, not a social platform, not a profit engine, but a living archive. Every article was handwritten before it was scanned, and each contributor signed their name beneath their words. It wasn't about speed, it was about ownership.
Its post carried weight, but someone had to stand behind it. The ledger online grew slow but steady. No ads, no clickbait, just honest tales. They taught people how to budget, how to barter, how to find dignity in craft, and somehow, in a world addicted to instant fortune, that quiet truth cut through the noise. The first year, 1,000 readers. The second, 10,000. By the fifth, 1,000,000, though no one in town bragged about it. Every subscription came with a message at the bottom of the welcome letter: "We don't sell success, we share patience."
Soon other towns started their own ledgers, following Stillwater example, each with local writers, craftsmen, and teachers contributing stories of their people's resilience.
They called it the network of hands. It wasn't just a system, it was a pulse, a global hum born of hollow first press. And just like that, the world began to tilt back toward balance. Corporate that once devoured small towns started changing their tone. Some adopted Stillwater model of shared profit and open education. Some didn't last, choked by their own greed.
It sells not product. But those who did found something Hollow had known all along. Honor schemes better than hunger. Then came a storm of a different kind, not one of fire or greed, but of loss. The wheat failed across the plains one harsh winter. The wind came down fierce from the north, rattling the fields and testing every lesson Stillwater had to learn. Supplies ran thin, the power grid froze, and trade routes closed. For months it looked like the hum might stop for good. But it didn't. The people of Stillwater pooled what they had. They printed survival guides in the ledger: how to preserve grain, how to share heat, how to repair tools with scrap. Neighbor called to neighbor, voice to voice across frozen distance. And in the dark they sang not hymns, not prayers, but the sound of the press turning, slow and sure. When spring came, the first thing to bloom wasn't the wheat, it was gratitude. That year, Stillwater Festival wasn't about harvest, it was about endurance.
Folks set up tapes, laid out tools, books, and food, and at sunset they read aloud from Hollow first issue, the one where he'd written,
"If gold you're after, you'll never have enough. But if peace is what you seek, you can build it with your own two hands."
Somewhere deep in the crowd, a young girl closed her eyes and whispered, "We remember the hum." The crowd echoed it, once, twice, until the air itself seemed to vibrate. And long after the fireflies came out, that hum rolled through Stillwater again, not from machines, but from hearts that had learned to wait. And if you'll find yourself driving down that lonely road between the wheat fields, with the rain tapping slow on your windshield, pull over, cut your engine, listen close. You might just hear it, that same low, patient hum, riding the wind, like an old friend saying, "Keep building, partner. You're doing fine." Years later, when the world had changed once again, when screens ruled hearts and silence became rarer than gold dust, Stillwater endured, steady it as. But the hum had become quieter, buried under noise, distraction, and convenience.
The young didn't sit by the fire to listen anymore. They scrolled through stories that vanished before the morning. The patience Hollow had taught had become harder to hold on to in a world that promised everything now. And yet even then, Stillwater had a way of finding its balance end. It always did. One night, a storm rolled in, not a gentle one, but a real howled lightning licking the horizon, thunder pounding like judgment. The power flickered, the network failed, and the whole town went dark. No phones, no screens, no hum but the wind. Folks stared instinctively at the ledger hall, where the old press still sat. A few lanterns flickered, throwing long shadows on those familiar brick walls. Among the crowd was a young man named Eli Porter. He was a programmer by trade, one of those bright lights who could talk to machines better than people. He'd grown none in Stillwater, but he'd always dreamed of the city. More data, more money, more motion. Yet the city had broken him. Too much speed, too little soul. He'd come back home only to find it quieter than he remembered. Yet a memory that refused to fade.
Summings that night, with the storm screaming out, Eli found himself staring at the old press. He'd passed it 1,000 times a time when he was a kid, but never really seen it. It's a boosters, lovers, theme trays, and yet it had printed words that outlasted whole empires. That thought stirred something deep in him. Old Mr. Duffy, the keeper of the press, was trying to relight the furnace when Eli stepped forward. "Let us see that," he said. The old man handed him the flint. Curious. Eli crouched, struck the spark, and smiled as the flame caught. "Guess the things don't need rebooting," he muttered. Mr. Duffy chuckled. "Ain't that the truth? She's temperamental, this old gal, but she still runs clean. You get her humming again, you'll feel it in your bones." Eli did. The moment the rollers turned, that same slow rhythm filled the hall. People fell quiet, listening. The storm outside raged, but inside, the hum was stronger. Someone fetched paper. Someone else brought ink. And before long, Eli was sitting at a table by lantern light, writing down what he felt in the moment. He didn't think. He just wrote about the noise of modern life, the hunger for more, the way the world mistook motion for progress. He wrote about how Stillwater hum wasn't just a relic, it was a reminder. By dawn, the storm had passed. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, hitting that first fresh print. The world don't need faster hands, it needs steadier ones. The new edition of the Ledger spread faster than any digital ad. They're good. Folks came by the dozens to read it, then hundreds. Eli didn't mean for it to go beyond Stillwater, but it did. Someone photographed it, uploaded it, and before long the quote was everywhere, on forums, blogs, even news stations. The world had found Stillwater again, but this time it wasn't investors or opportunists who came. It was wanderers, men and women who'd lost their sense of rhythm in the chase. They came looking for peace, not profit. Eli didn't turn him away. He reopened the old Ledger workshop, turning it into what he called the School of Still Hands. It wasn't fancy, just wooden benches, worn tapes, ink stains, and silence. But there, he taught the art of slow work, the beauty of focus, of the wealth in restraint. They printed words, not ads. They carved wood, forged tools, repaired watches, everything done with the kind of patience that make Hollow Briggs proud. When asked what his secret was, Eli would shrug and say, "I just listened to the hum." Years rolled on. The school grew, though not in size, just in meaning. People who learned there went back to their cities, their homes, their crafts, carrying the Stillwater calm with them. They built honest companies, fair trade shops, slow food kitchens. Some even started their own ledgers, printing with their hands instead of their thumbs. And slowly, piece by piece, the hum spread again, through hearts, through homes, through the tired gears of the world that had almost forgotten how to breathe. By the time Eli grew old, he'd stopped talking about technology altogether. Not that he hated it, but he'd finally understood it wasn't the problem. The problem was the pace. He used to sit out by the river where his hollow cabin once stood, watching the reflection of the sunset ripple in the water. Folks say he'd smile and whisper, "We didn't change the world."
It sounded like Slayer. Raynard, 400 miles away when he passed the townsfolk didn't build him a monument. They didn't name the street after him. They did something simpler. They replaced the Ledger banner with 3 quiet words printed in black ink, centered on the page. The hum remains. And sure enough, it did. Even now, when the world louder than then and patience feels like a lost art, that story still travels. You can hear it in the creak of a porch swing after a long day work, in the steady hammer of a craftsman's hand, or in the hush that follows rain hitting tin. Somewhere the hum's still moving from heart to heart, from word to word. If you listen real close, you'll hear it too.
After Eli passing, Stillwater settled into a deeper kind of quiet. Not the quiet of loss, nor the silence of abandonment, but the hush of understanding. The kind that comes after a song's final note fades and the listener just sits there holding the moment.
It reminded it how to wait. When he passed, the townsfolk didn't build him a monument. They didn't name a street after him. They did something simpler. They replaced the Ledger banner with 3 quiet words printed in black ink, centered on the page.
The hum remains, and sure enough it did. Even now, when the world louder than then and patience feels like a lost art, that story still travels. You can hear it in the creak of a porch swing after a long day work, in the steady hammer of a craftsman's hand, or in the hush that follows rain hitting tin. Somewhere the hum's still moving, from heart to heart, from word to word. And if you listen real close, you'll hear it too. After Eli passing, Stillwater settled into a deeper kind of quiet. Not the quiet of loss, nor the silence of abandonment, but the hush of understanding. The kind that comes after a song's final note fades and the listener just sits there, holding the moment. It's
Come on, like you great.
The other time, I like
Yeah, the fun remained, sure enough, but now it carried a softer edge. The town itself had learned to breathe slower, think clearer, and move deliberate in.
An old craftsman laying the final stroke on his life work. It was that time a drifter came wandering into town. Not the kind looking for work or charity, but the kind who carried too much in his eyes could be heed lost. His name was Jonah Reed. He'd been investment banker once, the kind who moved more money in a day than most men saw in a lifetime. But the crash his own, not the world, left him hollow. Too many screens, too many numbers, too many sleepless nights staring at figures that never added up to peace. He'd left it behind, sold the suits, walked away from the towers of glass that scraped at the sky, and followed the rails west until the noise in his head began to fade. Stillwater wasn't on any made there map anymore, not the kind the cities used. But word had a way of finding those who needed it.
Jonah heard whispers of a town that didn't chase profit, that lived slow and steady, where even the wind seemed to keep time. So he followed the stories step by step until one late evening he found himself standing at the edge of that familiar sign-faded paint, cracked wood, and one phrase carved deep at the bottom. We remember the hum. He smiled at that. It was the first honest smile he'd worn in years. He checked into the inn, more a house than a hotel. And that night he didn't dream of markets or losses. He dreamed of paper and ink and hands that built things instead of raking them. Come morning, he went looking for the ledger. He found it where it had always been, smelling of oil and time. The big press sitting quiet but alive. The caretaker, a woman named Ruth, was setting new type. She looked up when he entered, gave him a nod, then went right back to work. You a reader or a helper, she asked. He hesitated. Guess I'm looking to be both. Ruth studied him a second longer, then grinned. Well, there a broom by the door. Start with that. So Jonah swept floors, stained ink and fetched paper, and though his hands had once typed orders worth millions, they trembled the first day holding something real. The others didn't ask about his past. They just showed him how to oil the rollers, how to fold the pages clean, how to keep the press humming. Weeks passed. The work was hard but honest, and every night when he lay in that creaky bed, Jonah felt something new, a strange, peaceful exhaustion. He started reading the old ledgers after supper, studying hollow writings, Clara letters, Eli essays. They weren't preaching sermons or selling wisdom. They were telling truths you could build a life on. The words started changing him. He'd been a man who thought wealth was measured by how high a line climbed, how much you could make before the market fell again. But in Stillwater, he saw wealth in the way a farmer shared seed, in how Ruth stayed late making sure each print came out perfect, in the way kids ran barefoot through wheat fields without worry or want, and began understanding what hollow meant when he wrote. Patience ain't to waiting and trusting time to do its part. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled through, the lights went out again, just like an Eli day. The townsfolk bared at the hall, and Ruth lit the lanterns, handing one to Jonah. Reckon you've got something worth printing. Yes. Jonah stared at the blank page. Maybe, he said. So he wrote. Not about finance or systems or trade, but about redemption, about how a man could lose everything and still find something worth keeping, about how failure wasn't the end, but the soil, where peace could finally take root. They printed it that night, right there by lantern light, the storm pounding outside. The next morning, that issue went out across Stillwater, the word spreading like fresh air after a long drought. Folks read it over coffee in barns by firesides. Some wept, others smiled. One old rancher said, sounds like the hum got a new verse. Jonah stayed. He never went back to the cities, never traded stocks again. Instead, he became Stillwater teacher of numbers, showing the children how to make sense of money without letting it own them. Called his lessons the quiet math, and his blackboard bore a weird rule at the top: never add what doesn't multiply peace. As years rolled by, Jonah grew gray but not weary. He wrote often for the Ledger, his articles simple but strong, each one about building honest wealth, mending broken trust, or finding contentment in the spaces which the world noise couldn't reach. Became the bridge between the old and the new. When digital leaders reached out, Jonah didn't reject him. He taught him, instead taught how to slow down their scrolling, how to read leaked listening, how to see beyond headlines and find heartbeat in words. He even built a new column called The Modern Hum, where readers from around the world shared stories of small victories, families rebuilding after death, artisans reviving their trades, young folks learning to save with purpose. By the time Jonah passed, the ledger had become global again, but it never lost its Stillwater soul. Every edition ended with the same line, penned by his hand: "Prosper ain't the sound of coins, it the F's of work done right." When they buried him by the river, beside the others who carried the hum before him, the town didn't mourn. They laid around the press. Justin Hollow had, just as Clara and Eli had, and they turned it once more. The pages rolled smooth, the ink fresh, and the first words printed that night read, "We're still listening," and that was enough. Years passed, and the world beyond Stillwater spun faster than theirs. Artificial minds ran the markets now. Decisions made in fractions of seconds, fortunes lost and won before a man could blink. Most folks called it progress, but out there in the glow of those endless screens, something vital was slipping away. The hum, that steady rhythm of patience, of work done by hand, of trust earned slow, it was faint. You could barely hear it under the static of ambition. Yet in Stillwater, that old press still turned. Not every day, mind you, only when someone had something true to say. The ink still smelled of iron and time, the gears creaked like a saddle at dawn, and that familiar low hum filled the hall just like it always had. They said it was the same pitch at a man breathing steady after a long day labor, the sound of balance. The ledger was now run by a young woman named Maeve Hollow, descendant of Samuel Hollow Briggs himself. Folks said she had her great-grandfather calm in her eyes, though the world she lived in looked nothing like his. She wore denim instead of wool, carried a laptop in one hand and a fountain pen in the other. You were born between two worlds, the digital and the durable, and her life work was to bridge them without losing the soul of either. She kept the press alive, but she also built a digital archive so the ledger stories could reach across oceans. She didn't chase clicks or trends. She let time do its work, just like the town had always done. Each post had the same quiet integrity deed, the printed pages, slow words for a fast world. Maeve didn't preach about patience. She just lived it. She'd walk down to the river every morning, same spot her kin had stood for generations, tossing a pebble into the still water and watching the ripples spread outward. She said it reminded her how one honest act could move farther than you a sea. One spring morning, she got a letter. Not an email, not a text, a real handwritten letter, carried in an envelope yellowed by the road. It was from a man in the city, one of them high-rising types who made their living off charts and predictions. Wrote that he'd stumbled across the Ledger online archive one night, half drunk and half desperate, after losing everything in a market crash. He said he'd read Jonah Reed's quiet math essay and something in it broke through his noise. He wrote, "I realize I've been rich in all the wrong ways. I don't want more, I just want steady again." At the bottom he'd scrawled, "Do you teach patience?" Maeve smiled when she read it. She folded the letter, slipped it in her coat pocket, and went to the press room. That evening she printed a new ledger. No big headline, just a short piece titled "Patience is a Language." In it, she wrote about the rhythm of waiting, the grace in imperfection, the power of pulsing before acting. She ended it with a single line that became the motto of her time: "You can't digitize a heartbeat." The issue went out online and in print, and before long, letters started pouring in from across the world, handwritten, typed, recorded on old cassette tapes even. People told stories of slow rebuild a baker who cooked 2 years to perfect her recipe, again after losing her shop, a sailor who fixed his boat plank by plank after a storm, a widow who planted a garden one seed at a time, deaf to remember what it felt like to grow something big again. Maeve began publishing them under a series told The Long Way Home. Each story was humble, raw, and achingly human. She'd sit by the fire at night, reading each letter out loud before setting it gently into the archive. And every time she finished one, she'd whisper, "We remember." The ledger fame spread, though no one in Stillwater thought it that. They said it was just the world remembering itself. News outlets ran stories about the town that taught time, though Maeve never gave interviews. She'd tell the reporters, "You don't interview patience, son. You practice it." Then came the day she met a stranger who carried the future in a backpack. He was a coder, no older than 25, traveling cross-country with solar gear, a drone, and a half-busted tablet. "I read about Stillwater and came to see what all the fuss was about." When he met Maeve, he couldn't stop talking AI, automation, decentralized systems, blockchain farms, the works. He talked about how everything was being rebuilt smarter, faster, leaner. When he finally caught his breath, Maeve said, "Sounds like y'all are chasing the wind." He grinned, "Maybe. But what if we could make the hum digital, share it, multiply it?" Maeve thought about that for a long while. Son, she said, the hum ain't something you upload, it's something you remember. But the boy didn't give up. He stayed in Stillwater that summer, working alongside the locals, learning to fix fences, plant seeds, set ink. Slowly, his talking turned to listening. His restlessness eased. By the end of the season, he'd stopped coding for profit and started coding for peace. He built a simple app, not flashy, not loud. It was called The Hum. Each day, it showed one story from the Ledger archives, chosen at random, no ads, no comments, no likes, just one quiet truth to start the day. And somehow, that little app spread. Millions downloaded it, not because it shouted, but because it whispered.
A banker in Tokyo read it for opening his ledgers. A nurse in Brazil read it after a long night shift. A miner in Australia kept it on his phone for the few minutes of stillness before dawn. The hum had gone global again, but knocked on noise as memory. Maeve lived to see that sitting on her porch in the twilight, listening to the rain tap slow on the roof. She once said that peace wasn't about escaping progress. It was about teaching it how to breathe. When she passed, the last issue she'd edited rolled out of the press that same night. The headline was simple. Always, the hum don't die. It changes hands. And that the thing about the hum, it don't belong to one man, one town, or one age. It moves where it needed most, slipping between the cracks of time, whispering in the ear of anyone willing to slow down long enough to hear it. So if you're listening to this by a fire, or maybe to the soft patter of rain out your window, don't rush. Sit still a while. Take a deep breath. You're hearing it now, friend.
That same hum, reading through years, through dust, through memory. The one that built Stillwater, healed Jonah Reed, steadied May Hollow. It the sound of patience and of people who never stop believing that slow is sacred. And somewhere, in the rhythm of your own heartbeat, you'll realize, been there, belong. After Maeve passing, Stillwater didn't mourn with loud wails or black ribbons. No, sir. The town honored her the same way it had always honored those who carried the hum forward, by keeping still, keeping steady, and letting the sound of work done right fill the quiet. Her funeral was held under a gay sky, soft rain misting over the river, each drop humming like a low memory against tin roofs and old stone. The townsfolk dead with lanterns instead of eulogies, their faces half-lit, their hearts full. The old press stood silent that day, a sheet of clean paper waiting in its jaw. No one dared touch it until the last light faded and the river turned black as ink. Then, Ruth's son, now an old man himself, stepped forward and placed his hand on the lever. For Maeve, he said, and pressed down slow. The rollers turned, the ink spread, and one page slid out, smooth thing breathing. It read, "Still water runs deep, and the hum runs deeper." That was the only edition printed that day. Folks took turns passing the active firelight, nodding to they heard the say invisible tune between the words. Time its does moved on, but still water didn't rush to meet it. The press remained, it always had, and the ledger turned its pages only when the world needed reminding. The town had changed. There were electric trucks on dirt roads, solar panels where barns used to be, and screens in every window. Yet every screen in Stillwater ran slower than the ones elsewhere. Not because of poor signal or old marks, but because folks liked it that way. They said the delay gave them time to think, and maybe that would keep the hum alive. One evening, long after the sun had gone and the world of Dad was wrapped in electric glow, a traveler stopped by Stillwater Edge. She wasn't a banker or a coder or a drifter this time. She was a musician, a young woman named June Ellis, with a guitar case strapped across her back and city dust still clinging to her boots. She heard the stories about a town that breathed slow, about words that felt like prayer, about a sound older than music itself. She came seeking a song. June found the press first, then the old inn, then the river. She listened for hours but heard nothing but crickets, the creak of porch wood, and the murmur of the current. Frustrated, she packed her things and almost left. But an old-timer sitting by the general store loud out, "You don't hear the hum, missy, you wait for it." So she waited. She spent days watching the people of Stillwater go about their lives, fixing fences, mending roofs, teaching kids to carve or weave. No rush, no hurry. Every action was quiet and sure. Then, one morning, while sitting by the river strumming her guitar, she finally felt it not at a sound, but at a weight. The stillness of the place pressed gently on her chest until her heartbeat matched it, steady and slow. She began writing songs right there, not love songs, not protest songs, but songs about time, about work, about rest, about listening. She played them at the tavern then nights, the melody soft as a sigh. Folks would tap their boots, nod, and hum along, the way you hum when words ain't needed. Word got out, as it always did, and soon musicians from far-off places started coming to Stillwater, too. They wrote fiddles, harmonicas, and old pianos with busted keys. They didn't come to record or sell, they came to learn the pace. It wasn't long before they started something called the Stillwater Sessions. Once a year, when the fireflies came out and the wheat turned gold, folks would gather around the old press hall. No stage, no lights, just instruments, voices, and that eternal hum rising like smoke through the night. The air itself seemed to sing, and from those gatherings, a new kind of song was born, slow songs with quiet truths. Songs that weren't meant for radio or charts, they were for the heart. June recorded her first and only album bass sitting on the porch of Maeve Hollow Eld home while rain pattered soft on the tin. She called it Patience in E minor. The last track on it was called Stillwater. It was used to hum, recorded by accident. Wind, water, and breath. But that the one that spread, folks played it to fall asleep, to grieve, to think. Some said it helped them remember who they were before the noise. And though June passed years later, her song stayed. It was said that even the machines, the ones running silent cars in cities, began carrying fragments of that melody like a earth that refused to die. The Ledger printed one more issue to mark her memory. No author name, no tribute, just one line across the page. The hum is no longer in the press, nor the paper, nor the song, it in you, and so it was. The town of Stillwater never disappeared, but it never grew. Either it stayed exactly as it was meant to, a compass, not a monument. Travelers still came, leaving with more silence than they arrived with.
Every now and then, someone new would take up the press, write an article, record a whisper that reminded the world of patience. But the hum, that faithful hum, it was never about the machine or the words or even the town. It was about remembrance, about slow work, honest heartbeats, and the courage to stop chasing what don't last. And if you find yourself sitting by a fire, rain tapping gentle on the window, and the night stretching long, you might just hear it end. Not in your ears, but deep inside where your soul keeps time. That Stillwater speaking, it's saying, clear of the bell in the dark, steady now. You're right on time. Long after June's song had become a whisper in the world current, the hum endured. It found new hands, new hearts, new reasons to linger. Generain turned, as they always do, and though Stillwater stayed humble, its stories drifted far beyond the riverbed. In cities of glass and neon, people still spoke of the town that ran on patience, of words that didn't sell but settled.
Privileged way of saying. They said it was a myth, a place too slow to be real, too quiet to be remembered. Yet, late at night, when the world pulse got too loud, folks swore they could hear that faint rhythm again. The hum itself had learned to travel through the static. In those years, a man named Tobias Kane lived out on the edge of Stillwater, a craftsman of clocks. He was a wiry figure with smoke-gray hair and hands that never shook. His workshop smelled of cedar and brass, every surface lined with timepieces, a ticking as still. He wasn't a talker. Folks said he could fix a clock just by listening to its silence. He'd been a city man once, a designer of digital systems that mapped global time down to the millisecond. He built the kind of machines that told satellites when to blink. But one day, he stopped, sold it, came home to Stillwater, though it wasn't really home. He'd never been there before. He just felt it was waiting for him. He found an old cabin near the northern ridge and rebuilt it piece by piece. Didn't ask for help, didn't need any. The first thing he built after the roof was a filled clock, tall, heavy, and perfectly balanced, its pendulum swinging at half the usual pace. When folks asked why it was so slow, he said, because it's telling real time. Tobias didn't write for the Ledger, didn't sing or teach. He just built clocks and repaired what was broken. Travelers from other towns came to watch him work, sometimes bringing old watches, sometimes bringing nothing but questions. You wish to go back to the fast life, they'd ask. He'd smile, set another gear, and reply, son, I didn't leave time, I just stopped letting it chase me. As years passed, his clocks became known far beyond Stillwater. Not because they were ornate or rare, but because they were peaceful. People said when one of Tobias' clocks ticked in a room, the air itself seemed to slow, thought softened, hearts steadied. Businesses ordered them for their offices, homes, bought them for quiet corners, and before long, one found its way into the heart of a financial tower in New York City. They say that clock changed everything. It stood in a lobby full of screens in motion, ticking louder than the noise around it. Executives began noticing how they felt calmer near it, how meetings held in that room ran shorter but ended truer. One by one, people started ordering clocks from Stillwater. And though Tobias never left his workshop, his work traveled everywhere, into hospitals, schools, even trading floors. Folks didn't realize it, but they were buying a piece of the hum. Then came the visitor who changed Tobias' last days, a young woman, not more than 25, wearing a faded jacket with a patch that read Mavar tie. Her name was Clara Vale. She'd been studying the Ledger digital history for years, collecting everything from Hollow First writings to Jonah Reed math lessons. She wanted to recut the last voices of Stillwater, the keepers of the hum, before it slipped away again. When he found Tobias, he was sitting on his porch, polishing that old pocket watch. "You the one who builds time?" she asked. He looked up, grinning slightly. "Nah, just set it free." They talked long into the evening.
I asked him questions about patience, about the Hume, about what it meant to live slow in a fast age. Tobias didn't answer right away. He'd wind his clock, sip his tea, then speak at the man, letting the words come up from deep water. "Time ain't something you hold," he told her. "It's something you listen to. Same made that hum you're chasing." Clara asked if he'd heard it himself. He nodded. "Not with my ears, no. But when I finish a clock and it starts ticking true, the air goes still for a breath. That it right there, the hum. It what patience sounds like when it's proud of you." She stayed in Stillwater for 3 weeks, recording their talks, watching him work, learning the rhythm of his days. Every morning, Tobias wound each clock by hand. One by one, his movements so slow they seemed part of the pendulum swing. She noted that when he worked, the birds outside quieted, as though the whole world was listening. Before she left, she asked him what message he'd want the world to hear when she published her piece.
They thought for a moment, then said, "Tell him time don't move in lines, it moves in circles. And if they're lucky, they'll learn to meet themselves again at every turn." Clara wrote that down, tears welling in her eyes. When she returned to the city, she published her story in the Modern Hum, and the article went viral within hours. Folks said it read like a sermon disguised in silence. People who hadn't stopped to breathe in years sat down and read the whole thing twice. Tobias passed not long after. They found him sitting in his chair, the pocket watch still ticking steady in his hand. His clocks all kept perfect time that night, though no one touched them. The hum filled the workshop like a low hymn, so strong the air itself seemed alive. In the weeks that followed, people from all over sent messages to the Ledger, telling how they'd unplugged their clocks, taken longer walks, sat by the window just listening to nothing. And in that nothing, they said, they found everything they'd lost. That was Tobias' legacy, not the clocks, not the fame, but the lesson time, when respected, becomes peace. And so, the hum lived on, not in sound or ink or song, but in every slow heartbeat that dared to remember that truth. Out there beyond the hills of Stillwater, you can still find one of Tobias Kane clocks hanging in your quiet home or library. Listen close enough and you'll hear it ticking soft, ticking steady, humming with the patience of a man who finally stopped running, and somewhere between those ticks you might yet hear the hum too. Years after Tobias Kane clocks had found their way into homes and hearts across the world, Stillwater drifted into that quiet space between memory and myth. It was no longer a place you could easily find on a map. The roads to it grew thinner, overgrown by grass and time. GPS would fail halfway there, and cell surf faded long before you saw the first fence post. Yet every year, a handful of travelers still managed to reach it, not guided by technology, but by instinct, or maybe by something older still. They came from everywhere, engineers burnt out from the noise of their own machines, writers looking for truth instead of traffic, dreamers who couldn't sleep anymore. Some stayed a night, as stayed a lifetime. Well, but all of them left with the same quiet look in their eyes, like they'd been reminded of something they'd almost forgotten. Among those who came was a young man named Elias Ford. He wasn't a builder or a singer. He was what they felt a data miner, though what he mined wasn't gold or silver. It was people habits, their patterns, their time. He worked for one of them big tech outfits in the city, and he was good at it, too good. He could predict when folks would wake up, what they'd buy, how long they'd watch a video before skipping. He'd spent years tracking humanity in numbers until one day he realized he couldn't feel his own pulse anymore. Elias came to Stillwater without knowing why. He just needed to stop. The first night he stayed in the inn by the river. The place hadn't changed much in a century, wood creaking with every step, rain drumming a lullaby on the roof, and the faint smell of tobacco and ink hanging in the air. He couldn't sleep, so he wandered down to the old press hall, drawn by the faint flicker of lantern light. Inside sat a woman he'd never seen before, gay-haired, wrapped in a wool shawl, reading an ancient issue of the Ledger. She didn't look up when he entered. They said, "You look like someone who'd been listening to noise too long." He chuckled nervously. "You could say that." She nodded. then said, "It'll take a while before the quiet starts talking again." So he did. He sat beside her. The rain tapped its rhythm on the roof. She read aloud, slow and clear, from an old article titled "The Weight of Waiting." It spoke about men who planted trees they'd never lived to sit beneath, and about the kind of patience that shapes generations instead of minutes. Elias felt something loosen in his chest as he listened. By the time she finished, he realized an hour had passed without him reaching for his phone once. The woman smiled, folded the paper, and said, "Come back tomorrow." Then more where that came from. He did, and for the first time in years, Elias started to unlearn. Days in Stillwater had a way of stretching like the light lingered longer just for those willing to slow down. He'd wake with the sun, help the townsfolk mend fences or sweep the press hall, then spend the evening reading through old ledgers. He learned the stories of Samuel Hollow, of Maeve, of Jonah Reed, of Tobias and his clocks. He began writing in a small notebook, not for data, not for metrics, but for himself. The woman, whose name he later learned was Ada Breyer, was the last of the old keepers. She'd been part of the town quiet for nearly 80 years. My daddy used to say she told him one morning while grinding coffee beans by hand, "Stillwater ain't about stopping time, it about making peace with it." Elias nodded but didn't yet understand. One evening, while helping Ada clean out the press room, he found a box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were spools of magnetic tape, labeled in careful cursive, "Stillwater Voices 1960 to 1989. He asked Ada about M, but she only smiled and said, "If you can find a way to play 'em, maybe the hum will find you." So he did. Fixed up an old reel-to-rev player from the inn attic, dusted off the heads, and sat by the fire they pressed play. At first, there was old static. Then came faint laughter. Then stories, voices of old townsfolk, recording memories for no one in particular. You could hear the clatter of dishes, the murmur of wind, the creak of chairs. They spoke about seasons, harvests, heartbreak, rebuilding, faith. The longer Elias listened, the more the noise became melody. The pauses between words grew louder than the words themselves. He realized that was the hum, not a sound, not a song, but the space between things, the stillness where meaning lived. Elias spent the next year digitizing every tape, every let, every story. He didn't rush. He'd listen to one reel a night, write down what it made him feel, then leave it for a week before starting another. Ada watched him, sometimes saying nothing for days, other times humming along to the quiet. By the end of it, he'd built a collection called the Stillwater Archives, but he didn't publish it to the web like most would have. Instead, he sent one copy handwritten, bound in leather, to every person who'd once written to the ledger or played in the sessions or owned one of Tobias' clocks. On the first page, he wrote, "For those who remember slow and for those who forgot how the world found that anyway." Folks shared pictures of their copies, recorded readings, even built small gatherings around them. But Elias never took credit. He said the stories weren't his. They belonged to the silence that raised him. When Ada passed, he printed one final issue of the ledger in her honor. The ink was faint, the paper rough, but the words were carved in truth. It read, "We were never trying to keep time from moving. We were just reminding it where home is." After that, Elias left Stillwater. No one knows where he went. Some say he returned to the city and started teaching mindfulness to high-strung tech firms. Others swear he built a cabin out west and still sites by candlelight. But those who've read his letters know better. He wrote once, "Stillwater ain't a place, it a rhythm. And if you listen long enough, you'll find it humming beneath everything you do, and maybe that's how it meant to be. Stillwater ain't gone. It moved inside of us. Every time we pause before speaking, every time we choose patience over haste, every time we breathe deep and remember that the world don't owe us speed, Stillwater hums again." So next time you find yourself lost in the noise, friend, don't go searching for a town. Just stop, sit still, listen close. You'll hear it, the hum. The same one that carried through paper and clockwork and song and silence. It waiting for you. Always has been, always will. It wasn't long after Elias vanished that Stillwater began its final quiet transformation. Not an ending, no, just another fold in the great rhythm of things. The ledger building leaned a little heavier with each season, its wood soaked in a century of ink and patience. The clocks Tobias had built still ticked in their corners, each beat a whisper of something eternal. And though the town had fewer people than then before, it somehow felt fuller filled with echoes, stories, and that unspoken hum that had learned to travel without wires or words. Outward bound the river bend, where the willow trees drooped into the water and fireflies rose like prayers in the dusk. A new figure came walking. Her name was Ruth Calder, a writer with a past carved by both success and exhaustion. She'd written bestsellers, books about ambition, speed, and how to stay ahead. Her words had filled boardrooms and billboards alike. But one morning, sitting in her glass apartment high above the city, she realized she hadn't felt alive in years. Her sentences were sharp, but her spirit was dull. So she packed a bag, left her phone on the table, and followed a rumor about a town that never hurried. She reached Stillwater near dusk. The road gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to silence. The first thing she noted was the sound of her own breath, louder than she remembered it being. The air carried that slow sweetness of rain-soaked wood and distant thunder. There was a sign by the bridge that read, "You're right on time." She laughed when she saw it, thinking it was his local charm. But she crossed, the laughter caught in her throat. The hum was there, soft, real. She followed it to the end, where an old man sat whittling by the fire. His name was Amos Greer, one of the last keepers of the hum. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "City dust on your boots. Must have taken a while to shake loose." Ruth smiled. "Guess so. I'm just passing through." He chuckled low. "Ain't nobody just passing through Stillwater, Mom. You're here 'cause something in you been still longer than you realize." That night, the rain came down steady. Ruth couldn't sleep, so she sat by the window with a candle and an old copy of the Ledger she'd found on the nightstand. The headline was simple, "The Measure of Enough." The words inside were quieter still, no fancy advice, no lists, no graphs, just reflections on contentment, written by someone who clearly understood the weight of peace. It was not written to impress, it was written to remind. She read until dawn. The next morning, Amos brought her coffee and asked, "You're reading the Ledger for wisdom," she smiled. "Maybe for forgiveness." He nodded slowly. "Then you're reading it right, days turn to weeks." Ruth stayed longer than she meant to. She walked the paths Maeve once tended, sat by the same rivers where June had played her songs, and stood under the clock tower Tobias built. She began writing again, but not for publishers, not for profit, just for herself. Her words slowed down, deepened. Instead of telling people how to get rich quick, she started telling them how to get quiet true. When Amos learned what she was doing, he brought her to the press. The old machine still worked, though its gears moved with the patience of a century. He showed her how to ink the rollers, how to set the letters, how to let the press breathe between pages. "It ain't just printing," he said, "it remembering." Ruth nodded, hands trembling. She pressed down on the lever. The page came out clean, the ink shimmering like rain under lamplight. She'd printed her first story in Stillwater. Began with these words, "There comes a time when running out of breath don't mean you're tired, it means your soul been holding its air too long." Her little essay spread, though not the way her old books had. A copy would find its way to a library, then to a train seat, then to a stranger backpack. People read them on rainy nights or during sleep-late mornings. They didn't sell millions, but they changed thousands. And every reader said the same thing after. It felt like listening to rain on a roof you'd forgotten was there. Months passed. Stillwater grew smaller, quieter. Amos passed peacefully one winter morning, the Ledger folded neatly on his chest. Ruth kept the press running. She never called herself its editor, just its caretaker. The hum was her company. Years later, she wrote her final story, sitting by the river where it had begun. It was called The Worth of Slow. She didn't dress it in big words or fine lessons, just truth. Plain and steady, as footsteps on wet soil. "We thought wealth was something you held," she wrote. "Turns out it's something you hear. A rhythm inside the still moments. A peace that don't need proving. A hum that don't fade." When she died, the townsfolk, few they were, found her notebook open, her last words underlined in ink barely dry. "If you've a find Stillwater, don't tell nobody, just listen." They buried her under the willow tree by the bridge. The Ledger stopped printing after that, but the hum didn't stop. Some say when the wind passes through those trees, you can still hear the faint click of the press, the steady beat of Tobias clocks, and the voice of a woman whispering stories to the rain. And maybe that's what the hum had always wanted, to be carried not in words or papers or songs, but in the hearts of those who learned to slow down long enough to feel it. For though Stillwater became a legend, for others a destination, but for the few who truly understood it was neither, it was a way of brethren, a promise whispered between the tick of a clock and the fall of a raindrop. And that promise, dear listener, still stands. When the night stretches wide and the fire burns low, if you quiet your thoughts long enough, you'll hear it too. The hum. It'd been waiting, and it right on time. When Ruth Calder's story finally came to rest beneath that ballow tree, Stillwater itself seemed to sigh. The rain fell softer that year, and the river ran slower, like it was remembering too. The townsfolk who stayed behind didn't rebuild much. They didn't need to. They kept the lamps burning in windows and the benches by the press swept clean, just in case a wanderer found their way there again. But Stillwater wasn't done shaping souls. It never really was. Years later, long after the last issue of the Ledger had faded into history, a boy named Jonah, no kin to the first Jonah Reed, wandered into the valley. He was 16, all knees and elbows, the kind of kid who'd spent more time staring at screens than stars. His folks had sent him to live with his aunt out in the country, hoping a slower pace might do him a good. He wasn't much for conversation, but he carried a small camera and a notebook that never left his pocket. The first thing he noted about Stillwater was how quiet it was. Not empty quiet, alive quiet. The kind that hums beneath your ribs if you stand still long enough. He tried filming it at first, but the camera never seemed to catch what he saw. The light came out too harsh, the colors too clean. It was like the town refused to be digitized. He met an old farmer named Clay, one of the last keepers. Clay was bent like an old willow, his voice rough and gravel, but his laugh would still shake dust from the rafters. He took to Jonah right away. "You're carrying noise in your pockets," he said, tapping the boy phone. Might do you a good to set it down for a spell. Jonah grinned shyly but obeyed. For the first time in years, his hands were empty. Clay taught him how to mend fences, stack wood, and listen to the wind. Every sound got a story, he'd say. Ain't about what you hear, it about what stays with you after it gone. As the days passed, Jonah started noticing things he'd never seen before. The way dust floated like gold in the barn light, the slow blink of a horse eye, the rhythm of the rain against the tin roof. Filled pages in his notebook, not with plans or tasks, but with moments. And then, one evening, while walking along the riverbank, he heard it, low, steady, humming from somewhere deep beneath the water. It wasn't a song, not exactly, but it carried a warmth that made his chest ache. He ran back to Clay's porch, breath left, words tumbling out like a stream. "I heard it. I think I heard it. The hum." Clay just smiled, rocking slow. "Course you did, boy. It'd been waiting for you to listen." That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He lay awake, the hum still echoing inside him, as if the whole world had finally exhaled. The next morning, he asked Clay if he could record it, maybe share it online. Clay chuckled, spitting tobacco into a tin. "You can try," he said, "but the hum don't take kindly to wires. You don't capture it, you carry it." Still, Jonah tried. He set up his microphone by the river and waited. Hours passed, nothing, just the steady trickle of water and wind through grass. Frustrated, he kicked a stone into the current and muttered, "Guess I imagined it, that yes." When that Clay voice drifted from behind him. "You didn't imagine it. You stopped listening." Jonah turned. Clay was standing there with a lantern, its light flickering on the water. "You can't trap peace, son," the old man said. "You can only walk beside it." Those words stuck. Over the years that followed, Jonah grew into a man shaped by Stillwater rhythm. He never left completely, though he traveled to nearby towns to share what he'd learned. He started calling his talks the wealth of silence. Folks expected business tips or self-help advice. Instead, he spoke about the hum, about the way quiet could repair a heart faster than ambition could. At first, people thought he was just another dreamer, but then something strange began to happen. His audiences started changing. They'd show up restless and leave calm. Some cried, some quit their jobs, some just smiled and said, "I think I heard it." Jonah never recorded his talks. He said they weren't meant to be stored, they were meant to linger. But word spread anyway. Reporters wrote about him, companies invited him to speak, even universities asked for lectures. Yet he always turned down the biggest offers. When asked why, he'd grin and say, "Can't sell what already free." Decades later, when he'd grown old and gay, Jonah returned to Stillwater one last time. The town was barely a whisper of itself by then, just a few homes, the inn, and the old press long since silent. He found Clay rocking chair still sitting on the porch, the wood worn smooth by years of patience. He sat down, closed his eyes, and waited. And the hum came back. It was faint at first, then stronger, like the whole valley remembered his name. The wind stirred, the river sighed, and for a moment, the past and present folded together. Maeve, Tobias, Ruth, Elias, all of them humming in harmony. Jonah smiled through tears. "Guess I'm right on time," he whispered. They found him the next morning, still sitting there, notebook open on his lap. On the final page were 6 words written in neat, deliberate script. "Silence was the richest thing I owned." The world moved on, it always does, but the hum didn't fade. People who never heard of Stillwater began seeking places that felt like it, quiet corners, old forests, cafes without Wi-Fi. The hum had escaped its birthplace, drifting into the spaces where humans remembered to breathe. It may be that the greatest wealth there is, not money, not legacy, just the ability to sit in the stillness of your own company and feel time turn soft again. So, if you find yourself restless under the weight of the world, friend, do what Jonah did. Set down your noise. Step out spout. Let the wind carry what you've been holding. Somewhere in that hush, you'll hear it. The hum, patient and proud, and you'll know, same at every soul who come before, that you've been right on time all along. Time moved the way it always did in Stillwater, without permission and without apology. The seasons kept their slow rhythm, though fewer feet walked the old dirt paths now. The willow trees bowed deeper over the river, their long branches kissing the water with the tenderness of memory. The hum hadn't left, but it had gone quieter, softer, that if it were waiting for the next soul patient enough to notice it again, that soul came in the form of a man named Coulter Hayes. Folks in nearby towns taught him the drifter with the ledger, though no one quite knew what that meant. He rode a rusted old motorcycle, carried a weather-beaten sachet full of notebooks, and spoke like a man who'd seen too much and still hadn't made peace with any of it. His beard was streaked with silver, his voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. He wasn't a preacher, but he spoke like one when the fire got low. He wasn't rich, but he walked like someone who'd once been and lost it. Coulter had made and lost fortunes more than once. He was a trader in his younger years, the kind who understood markets like a gambad reads cards. Clicks in nearby towns taught him the drifter with the ledger, though no one quite knew what that meant. He rode a rusted old motorcycle, carried a weather-beaten sachet full of notebooks, and spoke like a man who'd seen too much and still hadn't made peace with any of it. His beard was streaked with silver, his voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. He wasn't a preacher, but he spoke like one when the fire got low. He wasn't rich, but he walked like someone who'd once been and lost it. Coulter had made and lost fortunes more than once. He was a trader in his younger years, the kind who understood markets like a gambad reads cards. But greed, it always does, had a way of asking for out one more hand. He built empires and watched them crumble, each fall teaching him less about money and more about the hollowness that came after. One rainy afternoon, reading aimlessly through back roads, his bike sputtered and died right at the edge of a broken bridge. The sign nearby, half hidden in moss, read Stillwater 3 miles. He laughed through the rain, muttering, "Guess you're still out there, old ghost town." He walked the rest of the way. When he reached the valley, it felt like time had folded in on itself. The air was thick with the smell of pine and riverstone. He followed the same road Ruth once had, crossing that same bridge with the same faded sign. Only this time someone had carved a new line beneath the old words. "You're still on time," he grinned. Well, that's something. The inn was still standing, though barely. He found a single room still stocked with candles and wood. The guest book on the counter had 3 names left on its last page: Ada Breyer, Ruth Calder, Jonah Ford. Beneath them, the ink was smudged. Like someone had started to sign but thought better of it. Coulter added his name under theirs, letting the pen drag a little too long on the why. He stayed. For the first few days, he didn't do much more than sit on the porch and listen. He'd light his pipe, sip from a tin cup, and stare at the river until the hum began to rise again in his chest. It had been years since he'd let himself slow enough to feel it. At night, he'd write, not about numbers or profits or losses. He'd done that dance already. No, these pages were about something older, value, what it meant, where it lived, how it slipped through your fingers when you tried to count it. One evening, he found an old printing plate in the inn cellar, a piece of metal etched with the words, "Patience is not idle." He cleaned it, polished it, and propped it by the window. It became his prayer. As weeks turned into months, wanderers began passing through Ed. Word of Stillwater had trickled out through whispers and rumor carried by those who'd once stumbled upon it and left change.
They came seeking peace, answers, or rather a dry place to rest their tired souls. Coulter welcomed them. He'd pour coffee, gesture to the chair by the fire, and say, "Ain't nothing new, Ed, but the quiet, but she'll teach you if you let her." They'd sit for hours talking about everything and nothing. Some left before dawn, others stayed long enough to remember how to breathe again, and every so often Coulter would pull out his notebooks and read from them stories of loss, of rediscovering worth, of the hum that never dies. The stories spread, people started sending letters to Stillwater addressed simply to the drifter. Coulter never wrote back, but he read every one. Some came from city folks trapped in the churn of ambition. Others from old farmers, tired soldiers, widows, or dreamers. They all asked the same question in their own way. How do you find peace when the world keeps asking for noise? His answer never changed. You stop answering, he'd tear a page from his notebook, write those words, and tack it on the wall beside his bed.
By the time winter came, the wall was covered in them hundreds of tiny truths, each written in that rough cowboy scrawl of his. Then one night, he found a letter that made his hands tremble. It wasn't addressed to him exactly, but to the next keeper. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged and folded 4 times over. The handwriting was unmistakable, old-fashioned, deliberate. It was signed Elias Ford. "The hum don't belong to us," it read. "We're just its storytellers. Pass it on when you're ready. And don't try to own it. It already knows what it's going." Coulter sat there by the fire for a long time after that, staring at the letter until the ink blurred with his tears. The next morning he loaded his sachet, filled his pipe, and stepped outside into the dawn mist. He walked to the same willow tree where Ruth had been buried, knelt, and whispered, "Guess it's my turn now." He left Stillwater that day, riding toward the horizon with the hum humming in his chest. No one had saw him in, but years later, strangers began finding his notebooks left in bus stations, cafes, and train cars.
Each one had the same line written on the first page. "You can't lose what was never meant to be owned." Those who read him said the same thing. It felt like sitting by a fire in the rain, listening to an old voice tell you something you already knew but forgot how to believe. And maybe that's what Coulter was hoping for. Maybe he knew the hum didn't need to be protected anymore. Just remember, Stillwater never disappeared. It just scattered. Into stories, into hearts, to the slow rhythm of folks who learned finally that peace ain't found in stillness alone. It's found in accepting that even stillness moves. And the hum, well, she's still traveling, friend. Through wind, through rain, through the hush between each word, I'm telling you now, if you listen close, you'll hear her too. The Ballad of Jedediah Cross. The rain had been falling steady that night, thick enough to turn the dirt road into memory. You could hear the old wooden porch complain beneath the boots of a man who hadn't stopped moving his whole life. His name was Jedediah Cross, and once upon a time, they called him the richest drifter west of the divide.
Funny title for a man who owned nothing but a pocket watch, a ledger full of debts, and a ghost-colored horse that never neighed unless thunder spoke first.
They said he made his fortune trading cattle, though others swore it came from gold, rail lines, or the blacker kind of business loans in silence. But what nobody could deny was that every dollar he'd earned seemed to weigh on him more than the last. He was the kind of man who could count the exact number of coins in his purse by the ache in his spine. Now Jedediah was sitting on that porch, staring at the horizon that wasn't there. The world had gone gay with the storm, and he could hear the rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto the boards. Each drop landed with the patience of a clock, ticking down a lifetime of regret. He'd come to this forgotten stretch of land for a reason, one last reckoning, though he couldn't yet name what kind. He'd buried friends, outlived partners, and outsmarted thieves, but money had been the sharpest outlaw of them all. It didn't shoot you, it just waited.
The story of Jedediah Cross began long before the rain, back when the West still had promise and a man could trade sweat for gold if he had the guts. Jedediah had started with nothing but a mule and an instinct sharper than a razor. He'd buy a thing cheap, sell it dear, and never ask questions that didn't pay. Folks admired him, called him ambitious, but those who knew him best said ambition wasn't his horse, it was his master. He rode across counties like a fever, always chasing the next deal. He built towns, tore others down, and left a trail of receipts thicker than his Bible. He didn't cheat nobody, at least not directly, but he never stayed long enough to watch what his profit cost. When he was 40, he had it et. Land, title, men who'd call him sir. They built him a grand house on a hill outside Dry Creek, and from his porch, he could see the smoke of every chimney that worked for him, but hid the funny thing about more. Don't ever bottom, you just keep digging. It started small, bigger contracts, riskier loans, rail shares, then came the crash. The mines he'd financed flooded, the crops failed, and the bank that held his gold locked its doors for good. Jedediah didn't go broke overnight, it was slower, crueler than that. He watched it drain away like sand between fingers. Men who'd toasted him last year wouldn't meet his eye this one. The land was still his, but the pride in it was gone. So one morning he saddled up, took what little he could carry, and rode out alone. Left the key to his estate with the caretaker and said, "If I don't come back, bury me somewhere the rain can reach."
For 20 years, no one saw him in. Rumors drifted. Some said he'd turned preacher, others said hermit, or maybe outlaw. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Jedediah wasn't hiding. He was learning. He took jobs no man of his name should have. Drove wagons, fixed fences, mended clocks. Every dollar he earned with his hands, he kept folded neat in his vest, but he never hoarded again. Instead, he started leaving coins behind, one in a church box, one in a beggar hand, one buried under the step of a widow house.
He'd stop, tip his head, and move on. When asked why, he'd say, because gold don't rot, but greed sure does. Over time, folks began seeking him out. Men who'd lost their shirts in the same storms he had. Women who'd inherited nothing but debt and shame. They'd come to him for advice, expecting numbers, charts, or secrets. But what he'd say was, plant something that don't die when you do. That line stuck. Became the kind of phrase folks carved into tavern walls. The strange thing was, it worked. Men stopped gambling fortunes. Families started small trades again. Farmers pooled together to fix a plow instead of buying two. The town of Bitter Gulch, near dead from the last panic, started breathing again. Jedediah didn't stay there long either. He never did. He was a man haunted by his own education, the slow realization that the richest years of his life were the ones when he'd owned the least. One autumn he came across a boy sitting by the road with a broken wagon wheel. The boy was no more than 16, clothes torn, eyes angry, said he'd lost everything in a card game gone wrong.
Jedediah fixed the wheel, gave him a biscuit, and asked, "What were you trying to win?" The boy spat into the dirt. A start, Jedediah smiled, sad and knowing. Then you've already got one. All you're missing is the patience to let it grow. He gave the boy a single silver coin and rode off. That boy later became the founder of a trading post that would turn into a town. Years after Jedediah's death, a statue of him was built there, not to a tycoon, but to a man who lost enough to know what mattered. But that part getting ahead of the story. See, Jedediah's final journey wasn't about teaching others, it was about settling his own books. The rain that night wasn't just weather, it was baptism. The kind a man gets only once in a lifetime when he realizes he's still got one debt left to piece. He reached into his coat, pulled out that old ledger, and opened it to the last page. There were only 2 entries left. On one side, all I took. On the other, all I gave. For the first time in 50 years, the columns balanced. To set the ledger down beside him, took off his hat, and looked up through the rain. "Guess I'm square now," he said softly. And for the first time in decades, he smiled. The next morning, the storm cleared. A traveler passing by found Jedediah still sitting on the porch, hat in his lap, ledger open. The pages had been washed blank by the rain. Only one thing remained legible, written in the fainted ink at the very bottom. "Wealth ain't what you keep, it's what you release and still feel whole." They buried him ASAP. The porch rotted away, the land turned wild, but the tale of Jedediah Cross rode further than he did. It was told in saloons, whispered in homes, and read in the quiet spaces between sunrise and work. And sometimes when the rain falls steady on that old wooden porch, folks swear they can still hear him murmur, "Plant something that don't die when you do." Years passed after Jedediah Cross passing, and the rain never quite sounded the same in those parts again.
It came softer, slower, but if it were remembering a man who had finally settled his accounts with the world, the porch he died on was long gone, eaten by rot and time. But folks who knew the legend said if you stood there at dusk, you could still hear his words ride in the wind, "Plant something that don't die when you do." At first it was just a story, one of those Wild West fables that saloon keepers tell between rounds. But somewhere out near Bitter Gulch, that story started growing roots. A few men who'd once worked under Jedediah, men who'd known both his greed and his grace, decided to honor him not with a statue or a plaque, but with a seed. They built a school, small at first, not much more than a barn with a bell. But it wasn't for reading or writing alone. It was for learning how to live right with what you have. They tamed it the Cross Institute of Trade and Temperance, though the locals just called it the Ledger House.
The first lesson written on the chalkboard was simple. You don't own what you can't walk away from. The man who wrote that line was Ephraim Lyle, a grizzled ranch foreman who'd once watched Jedediah turn a drought into a prophet. He'd seen the worst and the best in him. And after the old man's death, Ephraim gave up the ranch life to teach the thing Jedediah had learned too late. Discipline ain't about controlling money, it's about controlling yourself. Ephraim had never been much of a talker, but when he spoke, the room listened. He'd stand in front of the students, dust motes floating in the sunbeams, and say, "Boys, wealth don't come from winning, it comes from waiting. There's a world of difference between the two." One boy asked him once, "Sir, how do you know when you've waited long enough?"
Ephraim smiled slow, the kind of smile carved by weather and whiskey, when what you have starts growing without you touching it. Those early years were lean. Most families couldn't afford to send their children for long, so students came and went with the seasons.
The first lesson written on the chalkboard was simple. You don't own what you can't walk away from. The man who wrote that line was Ephraim Lyle, a grizzled ranch foreman who'd once watched Jedediah turn a drought into a prophet. He'd seen the worst and the best in him, and after the old man's death, Ephraim gave up the ranch life to teach the thing Jedediah had learned too late. Discipline ain't about controlling money, it's about controlling yourself. Ephraim had never been much of a talker, but when he spoke, the room listened. He'd stand in front of the students, dust motes floating in the sunbeams, and say, "Boys, wealth don't come from winning, it comes from waiting. There's a world of difference between the two." One boy asked him once, "Sir, how do you know when you've waited long enough?" Ephraim smiled slow, the kind of smile carved by weather and whiskey, when what you have starts growing without you touching it. Those early years were lean. Most families couldn't afford to send their children for long, so students came and went with the seasons. But word spread that this little school in the hills was teaching something no bank could sell, kind of wealth you could carry even if your pockets were empty. Travelers came, farmers, blacksmiths, wives who managed homes with nothing but patience and prayer. They'd sit under the willow trees behind the Ledger house and listen while Ephraim told stories about Jedediah rise, fall, and quiet redemption. Each tale had a moral, but not the kind you'd find in a book. More like a compass meant for storms. Money like fire, he'd say. You can warm your hands with it or burn your house down. Depends who's tending it. One year, a banker from the city rode in, a slick man in a fine hat, curious about this mountain school that had folks speaking of thrift and patience, that they were miracles. He watched a class through the doorway and laughed under his breath. These people could be rich if they'd learn to take more, he said. Ephraim looked at him with eyes that had seen men choke on their own ambition, and they could stay rich if they'd learn to need less. The banker left before sunset. Didn't say goodbye, but he donated a chest of gold coins to the school a year later with a note that simply read, "For whatever grows slow." That chest was never spent. Ephraim melted the coins down and forged a single iron bell, hanging it above the Ledger house door. Every morning he'd ring it once and say, "That's the sound of money you'll never owe." Time carried on. The old foreman died, the bell stayed, and new teachers took his place. They weren't scholars, not the kind with titles. They were doers, cobblers, ranchers, weavers, men and women who understood that value ain't written in ink, but in consistency. One of them was a widow named Clara Mays. She'd lost her husband to a mine collapse and had raised two sons with nothing but a patch of garden and the courage not to complain.
She became the first woman to teach at the Ledger house, and she changed the lessons in ways that echoed far beyond those walls. Jedediah Cross taught you about what a man should do with his fortune, she said, pacing the front of the room. But I'm here to tell you about what you should do with your failures. The room went quiet. You could hear the wind rattling the pan as you save them, she said. Same way you save pennies, because failure, when kept and examined, compounds just like wealth. If you learn from every loss, then you'll never be poor. That struck the townsfolk deep. Before long, Clara lessons became the backbone of the Ledger House creed. They held it the Cross principle. Save what hurt you, spend what healed you, and invest in what outlives you. Under Clara guidance, the town flourished in a quiet and measured way. No one grew extravagant, but no one starved either. Families stopped bragging about what they earned and started talking about what they learned. And every few years, on the anniversary of Jedediah's death, the people would gather by the hill where he was buried.
They'd bring lanterns, letters, and coins, some old and new, and place them in the soil by his grave. Not door payment, but good gratitude. They said that when the rain always came, never heavy, never cruel, just enough to remind everyone that the richest ground is the kind that water by remembrance. As generations turned, the story of Jedediah Cross became less about a man and more about a law of nature. The Ledger House stood long after the railroads changed, after the banks folded, after the world started chasing speed again. And yet folks still came, sitting under the willow trees, listening to that same whisper of rain that once fell on a man counting his last debt. No statues, no portraits, just a single wooden sign above the gate, whether ever but legible. The slow way, the sure way. And underneath it, in smaller letters that time never quite erased, plant something that don't die when you do, decades roll by. And the Ledger House became more than a school. It became a rhythm. Folks lived by it, measured their seasons by its bell, It wasn't the kind of place you came to get rich. It was the kind of place you came to learn how not to go broke. In your heart, your work, or your will, the people of Bitter Gulch had built something more valuable than any mine or rail. They'd built a way of thinking. By the time Eliam Cross, a distant kin of Jedediah, took over the keeping of the Ledger House, the world had changed beyond what any cowboy could have imagined. The steam age had given way to oil and wire. Men no longer traded cattle. They traded paper promises. Banks grew bigger, faster, colder. The hum of the telegraph had turned into the scream of engines. Folks had started forgetting how to wait. Eliam was a quiet sort, soft-spoken, with a streak of gay hair. Though he wasn't yet 40, he'd grown numb on his grandfather's stories of Jedediah fall and redemption. Where most young men his age were off building cities or chasing rail fortunes, Eliam stayed behind to tend the same fields his ancestors had plowed. But he had one difference. He'd been educated out east, where professors wore polished shoes and spoke of money like it was a living creature, wild, elusive, dangerous. When he came back to Bitter Gulch, he wrote books filled with words like markets, dividends, interest, and equity. But when he spoke them aloud to the townsfolk, they just stared at him like he'd swallowed a dictionary whole. So he shut the books and went back to the old ways, campfires, coffee pots, and simple talk. One night, sitting before a ring of young traders and farmhands eager to hear tales, he said, I went out east to learn the science of wealth, but I came back to remember the art of it. Out there they chase gold like it owes them something. Out and we let it earn its keep. He picked up a coal from the fire, holding it between his fingers like a teacher holding a coin. This here, he said, is money. Cold, black, useful, but dead if you don't feed it air. Folks back east don't breathe patience into heat. They burn it up trying to make light faster, but the flame that burns fast don't last the night. That was Eliah's gift. He could take the noise of modern finance and turn it into a story fit for a campfire. The people loved him for it. He started writing down his lessons in a journal, not for himself, but for whoever came after. He wrote it The Patient Ledger. Inside, he mixed old cowboy sayings with principles sharper than any Wall Street guy. A few pages read, every man has a market. Some sell hours, Ed sells skills, Ed sells silence. The wise man learns what part of himself should never be for sale. Another said interest is what the world pays the quiet man for letting it hurry without him. He taught his students to treat money like a seed, never to plant it in one season, never to eat it before it ripe. He showed them how to build what he called slow empires, little networks of trust, trade, and patience that made everyone richer without anyone needing to lose. It was not just about coins or ledgers anymore. Eliam words start seeping into the town bones. Shops stayed open longer hours, not because they were desperate for profit, but because they enjoyed serving. Farmers began sharing plows. Again, the old blacksmith started forgiving late payments, saying he'd rather earn respect than interest. People began to breathe together. And then came the boom, a storm that didn't bring rain, but gold dust. A traveling investor rolled into Bitter Gulch one summer, dressed fine and smelling of city perfume. He'd heard rumors about a rich vein of ore in the nearby hills, and he was looking for local hands to stake claims. You folks sit on a fortune, he told the crowd at the tavern. All you gotta do is dig. Half the town took the bait. Men sold their fields, pawned their heirlooms, and marched into the hills with shovels and dreams. The sound of pickaxes replaced the bell of the Ledger House. The wind prayed. The old men shook their heads. Eliam watched it in silence. He didn't stop them. He'd learned long ago that greed was a teacher crueler than any man alive. But he left a note Kent to the Ledger House door.
Pimperoni field of Fiji was worth more than a mountain that promises gold. 6 months later, the hills caved in. Not from an explosion or a curse, just from too much digging. The vein was shallow, the gold fooled. The investor vanished before the dust settled. Families came back broke, ashamed, and hungry. Bitter Gulch nearly died that winter, but Eliam didn't curse them or say, "I told you so." He just reopened the Ledger House, rang the bell, and said, "We start again." He taught them how to rebuild slow, deliberate, steady. He took the empty mine carts and turned them into seed planters. The shafts that once swallowed men's hopes were turned into grain storage. And by spring, the town was alive again. When asked how he'd known it would all turn out, Eliam said, "Because soil don't hold grudges." In the years that followed, the patient ledger spread beyond Bitter Gulch. Traders, bankers, even city men started coming to hear Eliam speak. His voice had that stillness you own hear from someone who's seen both famine and feast. He ended every talk the same way: you can't outsmart the rain.
You can only learn when to plant. We died. The townsfolk buried him beside Jedediah. 2 stones side by side, one carved with "Plant something that don't die," the other with "Wait till it ready." The world moved on, dead machines, wires, stock tickers, but the lesson stayed. Somewhere deep in those hills, folks still say you can hear that Ledger House bell ring on quiet mornings. the elk drifting over the land like a whisper. Patience pays better than gold. Years turned to decades, and what Eliam Cross had written in the patient ledger began to outlive the town that birthed it. Copies found their way into rail cars, steamboats, and city libraries, passed hand to hand like a good luck charm for the weary and wise. The words written in the quiet rhythm of a man who'd known both drought and abundance began whispering to a new kind of soul, the kind that worked under electric light, not moonlight. Men in press suits read his sayings between the cracks of their long days, and it claimed it steadied their hearts the way whiskey once steadied their hands. Bitter Gulch itself grew smaller, quieter, until it was more memory than map. You can unlearn when to plant. When he died, the townsfolk buried him beside Jedediah. 2 stones side by side, one carved with plant something that don't die, the other with wait till it ready. The world moved on, dead machines, wires, stock tickers, but the lesson stayed. Somewhere deep in those hills, folks still say you can hear that ledger house bell ring on quiet mornings, the elk drifting over the land like a whisper. Patience pays better than gold. Years turned to decades, and what Eliam Cross had written in the patient ledger began to outlive the town that birthed it. Copies found their way into rail cars, steamboats, and city libraries, passed hand to hand like a good luck charm for the weary and wise. The words, written in the quiet rhythm of a man who'd known both drought and abundance, began whispering to a new kind of soul, the kind that worked under electric light, not moonlight. Men in press suits read his sayings between the cracks of their long days, and it claimed it steadied their hearts the way whiskey once steadied their hands. Bitter Gulch itself grew smaller, quieter, until it was more memory than map. The ledger house stood empty for a time, its bell rusted silent. The willows that once shaded its yard grew wild, their roots twisting through the old porch boards. But what no storm or season could wash away was the idea that had been planted there that money, like soil, demanded respect for reward. Then, in a century far removed from Jedediah world, a young woman named Mara Cross, one of the last bearing that name, rode into what was left of Bitter Gulch. She wasn't a rancher or a coup teacher. She was what the modern folk called an analyst, which was just another word for someone who stared at numbers until they turned into stories. Her eyes were city-tired, the kind that had seen too many bright screens and not enough sunrise. Mara had grown up hearing her grandfather talk about the Cross bloodline, about men who'd built fortunes and lost them with equal grace. But what stuck with her most wasn't the tales of wealth. It was the silence that followed them. Every Cross her granddad once told her, learns too late that the hardest thing ain't earning money, it's keeping your soul while doing it right. When her job let her go, when the market crashed and her accounts thinned like dust, Mara packed what she had and went west. She didn't know at what she was looking for, maybe peace, maybe penance, but something in her bones told her to find the place road her story had begun. She found Bitter Gulch half swallowed by the earth. The old main street was a trail now, and the only signs of life were the vines crawling over the ledger house. The bell still hung there, cracked but whole. The door creaked open easy, if it remembered her footsteps from lifetimes past. Inside, the air smelled like dust and rain, the perfume of ghosts who'd never really left. On the teacher desk lay a single book half buried in cobwebs. Its cover was worn soft by 1,000 hands. Across the front, carved faint but deep, were the words, "The Patient Ledger." She opened it slow, and the pages seemed to breathe again. The ink had faded, but the lessons hadn't. Never measure success by speed, measure it by stillness. The man who can wait without worry owns more than any king. Another page read. Every time you spend, you're voting for the kind of world you want to live in. Mara sat there for hours, reading until the sun dipped and the rain started its soft applause against the roof. The wind rattled the windows like it was humming approval. She felt something loosen inside her, some knot she'd carried since her first paycheck, maybe longer. That night, she lit a small fire in the stove and wrote her own entry at the back of the ledger. The modern world calls it investment. The old world called it sowing. Either way, the ground still knows the truth. Not everything planted grows, but everything that grows started with faith. She stayed in Bitter Gulch through the winter, fixing up the ledger house one board at a time. Folks from nearby towns started visiting out of curiosity. They found her sitting on the porch with coffee and quiet company, teaching the same way Eliam once had. No fancy talk, no grand schemes, just common sense wrapped in patience. Money ain't evil, she'd tell them. Laid is loud. You gotta teach it how to whisper aid. Word spread fast. Before long, people from the city began coming too. Tired souls with empty accounts and empty at heart, some came with notebooks, others with nothing but questions. Mara never turned anyone away. She didn't call it a coup, but that what it became a place where lost people came to remember the slow way. She started keeping her own ledger, a continuation of Jedediah, Ephraim Owen, and Eliam wisdom. Her writing was lean and sharp, the way a blade gets after years of feed. One passage read, "The most dangerous debt a person can owe is to their own impatience. Another, wealth without humility is just a storm with no rain." Over time, those words began drifting through the modern world like embers caught in wind. They reached podcast microphones, lecture halls, even office cubicles. Folks who'd never seen a horse or held a shovel started quoting her in boardrooms. They called her the Rain Woman of Bitter Gulch. Mara didn't care much for the attention. "If you're listening for my voice," she said once in an interview, "you've already missed the lesson. I'm just at." Still, she kept teaching day after day until her hair turned silver and her hands learned the tremble of time. One evening, a reporter asked her, "Why do you think people keep combing out he when the world got all the information they need at their fingertips?" Mara smiled the way a sunrise breaks a long night, because information ain't the same as wisdom, darling. You can fill your pockets with the first, but only the second will keep you warm. When she passed, the Ledger House bell tolled on its own 3 soft rings carried by the wind. Folks from miles around came to bury her beside Eliam and Jedediah. The 3 names carved in stone read like verses from a single prayer: "Plant something that don't die, wait till it ready, teach it to grow again." And when the rain fell that night, it was not mournful, it was grateful. "Into the material womb meet, and it was glorious." It sounded with applause, soft and steady against the ground that had once swallowed greed and now blossomed patience. No one rebuilt Bitter Gulch after that. It didn't need rebuilding. The town lived on in voices, in quiet thoughts, in every man or woman who chose to save instead of spend, to breathe instead of rush, to give instead of grasp. And sometimes, when the world outside grew too fast, too loud, too hungry, people would close their eyes and hear that old cowboy whisper carried by the wind of time. Patience pays better than gold, and it lasts longer too. Years after Mara passing, the Ledger House once again stood alone under the long sky, surrounded by wild sage and the whisper of wind through the willows. The bell above the doorway no longer rang by human hand. It moved only when the wind decided it should, tolling like memory itself, reminding anyone who passed through that patience had its own kind of voice. Time, it always does, stretched and bent. The world beyond Bitter Gulch became a place of glowing screens and blinking markets. If fortunes were made and lost before a man could sip his morning coffee. Wealth was now a number on a screen, weighty and restless. But even in that fast and flickering world, stories still traveled. And the patient ledger, in its worn and rewritten forms, found new life in the hands of those who hungered for something the modern world had stolen: quiet certainty. One such soul was Silas Wren, a man of numbers who had forgotten what they meant. He wasn't born in Bitter Gulch. He was born in the city towers, sleep-late lights, and a pace that never forgave stillness. Silas was what they said a quantitative strategist, a man whose entire life revolved around prediction, precision, and the endless race to stay ahead. He had everything: money, reputation, and the kind of success that left no room for breath. But when his world cracked, when markets crashed and his company turned from partners to vultures, he felt something in him split like an overworked beam. The numbers that once sang now screamed. His wealth, once mighty, had no taste. His sleep became a stranger. Found himself walking home one night through rain that felt more alive than he did, and that when he remembered an old story, one his grandmother used to tell about a bell that rang for the broken and the proud alike, somewhere out west. He didn't know why, but the next week he bought a ticket. No destination in mind, just the pull of silence. Days later, his train stopped at a ghost of a town the map still called Bitter Gulch. He stepped off the platform and felt something unfamiliar under his feet, stillness that didn't demand anything from him. The Ledger House stood at the end of the road, its roof sagging, its windows clouded, but alive in the way old things are patiently waiting to be remembered. He pushed open the door and found dust motes dancing in a shaft of afternoon light. On the desk lay a small pile of ledgers, bound in leather and inked by hand. Each was dated different, but the names in the corners told the same story: Cross, Mays, Lyle, Wren. He froze at that last one, his own name. He opened the book and read a note written in a hand far older than his time. "You've come looking for profit. You'll leave empty." But if you've come looking for peace, sit down. Silas did that. He sat, he read for hours, days maybe. It was hard to tell time there. The words inside were old, but they cut clean through his noise. The faster you chase, the smaller your circle becomes. The slower you move, the wider your world grows. Another line, when you can't count your blessings without counting your money, it's time to start over. He stayed the night on the floor with the rain tapping gentle on the roof and the fire he'd lit humming low. For the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of deadlines or digits. He woke at dawn to a world washed clean. Something in him shifted that morning. He wasn't sure if it was regret or revelation, but it came with clarity. He wrote in the back of the ledger, his handwriting neat but trembling, "I have mastered money, but I have not yet learned its mercy. Today, I start learning it, and for the next 6 months, Silas stayed. He cleaned the ledger house, patched the roof, mended the door. He rang the bell each morning, not to summon anyone, but to remind himself he was still here. Folks from nearby towns began stopping by, curious about the stranger who'd revived the old place. He didn't preach, didn't claim wisdom, he just listened. Sometimes that was all a person needed. He started teaching again, but not with charts or numbers. He taught what he called still wealth, the kind you build in the pauses. Every minute you don't spend, he'd say, is worth more than the dollar you earn too quick. Word spread, slow but steady, let roots underground. Journalists came, writers too, all wanting to make a story out of him. He refused most of them. But one day, a young man from the city showed up, a podcaster named Dane Holloway, eager to record the old lessons for the new world. Dane sat across from Silas with a small microphone and a nervous grin. "Mr. Wren," he said, "what do you think people today need to understand most about money?" Silas leaned back, staring at the ceiling, beams that he could see through time. "That money ain't evil," he said, his voice low, and measured, "little honest. It does exactly what you do. It gets restless when ignored, cruel when worshipped, and calm when tended." Dane nodded, scribbling notes. "And what the most important investment a man can make?" Silas smiled faintly. "Patience," he said, "and a porch sturdy enough to sit on while it grows." The podcast went viral, they say. Millions listened to the slow, gravelly voice of a man who sounded the time itself, speaking through rain. The Ledger House became a pilgrimage site, not for the greedy, but for the tired, for people looking to unlearn their haste. They wrought books, journals, even digital screens, but when they sat under those willows, the noise faded. Some cried, some just listened, all left changed. Silas never called himself a teacher or a preacher. He said Miaskipan watch on borrowed ground. And when he died, quietly in his chair by the stove, the townsfolk buried him beside the others, the wind carrying his last words across the hill. Don't rush to leave a mark. Just live so the ground remembers your steps. Years later, the Ledger House door stood open again, the rain humming against the wood, and a new traveler entered. One who'd never met Jedediah, Ephraim, Clara, Iliam, or Mara, but somehow knew a man through what they'd left behind. And so the circle continued, slow, humble, endless. The traveler who stepped through that door was a woman named Ruth Calder, a writer whose pen had lost its honesty. She'd made her living telling people how to manifest wealth, how to seize their destiny, and how to make it big before 30. Her books sold millions. Her name glittered across screens, but her words had grown hollow, empty echoes in a canyon she no longer believed in. The world had crowned her a guru, but she felt more like a ghost wearing success, like a borrowed coat. She came to Bitter Gulch not out of faith, but fatigue. Her publisher had dropped her latest manuscript, set lacked fire. Her fans had turned restless, hungry for louder promises. So when she saw a mention of the Ledger House of Bitter Gulch in an old financial journal, an article about a man named Silas Wren who taught patience in a world that sold speed, and something in her stirred. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe both. The road there was long and unkind. Rain followed her most of the way, a slow, steady pour that turned the dust into mirror pools. When she arrived, she expected to find ruins. Instead, she found quiet, the kind that didn't accuse, didn't forgive, just existed. The bell above the doorway was cracked but whole, and the sign, though faded, still read the Ledger House. Inside, everything smelled of time oak, smoke, and the faint ghost of oil lamps. Books lined the walls, not in order, but in comfort, like old friends sitting shoulder to shoulder. On the teacher desk lay an open ledger, the handwriting steady and deliberate. She ran her fingers over the ink, and it might still be warm. The last entry read, "What you keep will die with you. What you teach will outlive you." She sat in the chair across from it and exhaled like she hadn't in years. For a long while she just listened. To the rain, to the creak of wood, to the sound of her own thoughts unclenching. Then she began to write. Not a book, not a sermon, just thoughts, raw, uneven, true. "I have written for applause," she confessed on the first page. "I have measured worth by the number of eyes watching. I forgot that a seed grows best in silence." Days turned into weeks. Ruth stopped keeping time. She mended the shutters, swept the floor, and left wildflowers on the graves behind the house. "I forgot that a seed grows best in silence." Days turned into weeks. Ruth stopped keeping time. She mended the shutters, swept the floor, and left wildflowers on the graves behind the house. She found the stones, runked across, ran maison names she'd never known, yet felt tied to, like threads in a single quilt. Each evening, she lit a small fire, brewed coffee, and read aloud from the patient ledger. The words were simple but heavy, truth without perfume. One passage she returned to again and again: "The world don't pay you for what you say. It pays you for what you mean." She started recording her readings, not for fame, but for memory. She'd post them quietly online under the name The Quiet Ledger. Her voice, slow worn, a touch of gravel, found its way into late-night playlists and rainy morning routines. People didn't know who he was, and she didn't tell them. They just listened, and they felt still. The channel grew in secret, watched not by millions, but by the kind of people who needed it most. The sleep late, the overworked, the ones who'd traded rest for relevance. They left comments that read like confessions. "I stopped trading today. Just watched the rain. I paid my debts, then forgave one I couldn't collect. I started saving not money, but mornings." Ruth smiled at each one. That the interest, she whispered to the empty room. That what grows over time, she began teaching small gatherings. Folks would come from far-off cities, young dreamers, old traders, burned-out bankers, all sitting around a low fire out the ledger house. No microphones, no programs, no tickets, just voices under starlight. She'd start each meeting with the same phrase: "We're not there to chase wealth, we're here to understand its shadow." Then they'd talk, not about stocks or strategies, but about rhythm, about the seasons of work and the necessity of stillness. "The earth don't bloom all year," she'd say, "so why do you expect to?" And they'd listen, because she spoke like rain steady, unhurried, with the weight of someone who'd already walked through the storm. One night, a young man asked her, "Miss Ruth, do you believe in legacy?" She poked the fire and said, "No, I believe in continuation. Legacy is a name on a wall. That continuation is someone carrying your thought forward, cause it still breathes." By her third year in Bitter Gulch, the Ledger House had become alive again. Not a shrine, but at a workshop for still souls. People planted a small garden out back, where they grew herbs and vegetables that fed whoever needed them. They rebuilt the porch with old timber, carved the phrase "Patience Pays" above the door, and hung a lantern that never went out. Ruth never advertised. The people came by way, by chance, by eight. Each left with something no currency would measure, peace bought through time, not trade. Before long, the Quiet Ledger recordings became a worldwide whisper. You could hear her voice playing softly in cafes, office cubicles, and truck cabs on rainy nights. Folks said it felt like sitting by a campfire with someone who'd seen the same hurt you had and didn't try to fix it, just sat with it. Her final entry in the ledger read, "If money is movement, then peace is gravity. When you stop running, you start remembering what it was for in the first place." When she passed, no one announced it. The video stopped one winter, quiet teens they'd begun. But on the first night of spring, the bell above the Ledger House rang 3 soft notes on its own. The sound carried far over the hills, through the towns, into the hearts of those who'd listened. And across the world, people stopped just for a moment and looked out their windows at the rain. That's how the story of the Ledger House lived on. Not through headlines, not through airs, but through the hush that followed. For whenever the world grows too loud, too fake, too certain, there will always be someone somewhere whispering in that old cowboy drawl over the sound of gentle rain. Patience still pays better than gold. Decades rolled by, and the Quiet Ledger became one of those strange legends that bridge centuries, the kind of thing folks stumbled upon when they weren't looking for it. The voice of Ruth Calder, That slow, gravel-warm drawl drifted through digital dust like a ghost of the old frontier. You could hear her talk about patience and peace over the hiss of city subways, or through the earbuds of overworked souls staring at spreadsheets at midnight. Fisherman folks stumbled upon when they weren't looking for it. The voice of Ruth Calder, that slow, gravel-warm drawl, drifted through digital dust like a ghost of the old frontier. You could hear her talk about patience and peace over the hiss of city subways, or through the earbuds of overworked souls staring at spreadsheets at midnight. People didn't always know who she was or where Bitter Gulch even sat, but they felt her words. They felt the stillness she'd left behind, did a faint lantern glow through fog. The Ledger House itself had no owner then, just caretakers who never stayed long but never truly left. They were wanderers, mostly artists, builders, poets, a few broken business folks who'd burned out on the city flame. Some stayed a season, of a decade, all left something behind. That was the rule. You didn't pay rent in Bitter Gulch, you paid in wisdom, in lessons written down and bound in those old brown ledgers stacked along the wall. Each spine told a piece of the same truth, but spoken in a different tongue. One spring, a drifter named Tom H. Hetchley wandered into the valley. He wasn't rich, wasn't poor, just lost in the way men sometimes get after 2 mid-years chasing ghosts with different names. Used to run a big construction company, they said, until the markets turned and the money left quicker than it came. He'd built towers that touched the sky but couldn't build a home that stayed. Divorce took the rest. Found Bitter Gulch by accident, or maybe it found him. He was following an old rail line west, camping near rivers and abandoned depots, when he saw the bell tower on a hill, glinting dull gold under sunset. Something in him stirred the same way it had for all the others before. When he stepped inside, the place looked like time itself had been waiting for him. A half-finished ledger sat open on the tail, pen resting across its spine. The last words written there were from a caretaker long gone. The house don't need a keeper, it needs a listener. Tom chuckled under his breath. Well, he said aloud to the dust, I got nothing but time to listen. He set his pack down and stayed the night. And just like that, the Ledger House had a new soul breathing within its walls. Weeks passed. Tom fixed the porch steps, oiled the hinges, cleared the weeds growing through the boards. He never wrote much at first, didn't think he had the right. But one evening, the rain whispered on the roof. He poured a cup of coffee and began scribbling. Not advice, not lessons, just stories. Little ones about the men he'd worked with, the jobs he'd lost, the moments that still kept him up at night. And when he read them back, he realized they weren't stories about money it had. They were stories about worth. That when he started writing again in earnest, you can't measure a man's value by what he builds, only by what he'd rebuild after losing it. Another don't chase the harvest if you ain't learned to love the seed. Those lines stuck to the walls like the scent of rain-soaked cedar. Folks started coming in, wanderers drawn by the same whisper that had called Silas and Ruth. Some came for counsel, others just for silence. Tom never claimed to teach, but people listened anyway. He had that kind of voice, the low, slow rumble, of a man who'd learned things the hard way and didn't hold it against you for learning slower. He began recording nightly talks by the fireplace. They weren't meant to be sermons, just musing to the dark. He called the recordings campfire notes. In time, they spread across the world the same way Ruth Ledger once had. You could hear him late at night, the fire crackling soft, his voice rough to bark, saying, I used to think success was about reaching higher. Now I know it about staying grounded. People started reading back letters, emails, even handwritten notes left at the door. Some came from ranchers, some from stockbrokers, some from kids who'd never seen open land. But they all said the same thing in different ways. You reminded me how to breathe. Tom never replied to most. He didn't think he had the answers, but he kept their letters in a chest beside the stove. On lonely nights, he'd read a few and smile, mumbling to the empty room. Guess the world still listens to whispers after all. Then one winter, when the snow buried the trail and the power lines fell silent, Tom grew sick. He knew it was his time and didn't fight it. He spent his last night by the fire, reading slow, careful strokes. You will find this house, don't thank me. Thank the quiet, had been doing the real teaching since long before any of us showed up. He died before dawn, the ledger opened, the pen still warm. When spring came, a young couple found him travelers, who'd been firing his campfire notes online. They buried him under the willows beside the others and carved one line into his stone. He listened till the quiet spoke back. After that, the Ledger House passed into yet another set of hands, and then another. It never belonged to anyone for long, but it always belonged to someone. And through each generation, one man never changed. The fire was kept lit, The bell tolled when the wind was right, and the ledgers kept filling page after page of lessons from strangers who somehow all spoke the same language of humility and hope. It may be that the truest kind of wealth, the kind that don't spin, don't fade, don't die, for as long as there's someone sitting under a tin roof, rain humming steady overhead, wondering what all their hurry been for, there'll be a voice in that stillness, low and kind, whispering, slow down, partner. The gold you're digging for ain't in the ground, it in the weight. The years kept rolling like tumbleweeds across a sun-bleached plain, and though names changed, the quiet promise of Bitter Gulch held. One generation caretaker would fade into the wind, and another would wander through that same door, drawn by something they couldn't rightly name. The old bell above the entry still swung when the weather turned, tolling its rusty hymn through fog and rain. By the time Harper Lane arrived, the world had gone faster than any horse could run. Markets traded by the millisecond. Fortunes rose and fell between blinks, and folks had near forgotten what waiting meant. Harper was a creature of that world brilliant with data, numb with burnout. She'd built algorithms that predicted human behavior so precise they scared even her. But she hadn't laughed in years, hadn't looked at the stars without a dashboard glow in her eyes. One night, she heard an old recording, a crackling voice from one archive labeled Campfire Notes, Bitter Gulch Collection. The voice drawled slow and certain. If you're listening, you've already slowed down enough to start remembering. Something inside her, some buried hunger, answered back. Within a week, she quit her job, packed a duffel, and drove west with no destination but the sound of that voice. She found the town near dusk, just as a summer storm rolled in. The Ledger House leaned they could always had, stubborn but steady. Inside, the fire pit still sat in the center, surrounded by benches worn smooth by years of stories. A Sid lantern burned beside a ledger open to a fresh page. Harper touched the pen and felt the weight of every hand that had come before. No fanfare, no revelation, just a simple piece, like she'd finally arrived somewhere she didn't have to prove nothing. She stayed. For weeks she read every ledger, every margin note, every scrap of wisdom scrawled between water stains and ash. They weren't instructions, not really, just fragments of lives that had learned the same lesson over and over. The faster you chase, the more you lose sight of what matters. By autumn, she'd begun adding her own entries, but unlike the rest, hers came written in numbers and patterns, a language of her own craft. She started building what she called the stillness algorithm, a strange contraption of math and mercy that didn't predict markets or trends, but measured calm. She tracked sunrise to sunset, heartbeats to breaths, rainfall to candle burn, translating all that quiet into data that hummed like wind to pine. She laughed the day it first worked. The machine printed a fill line on paper, stillness index, enough it didn't make sense to anyone else, but to her, it was the true white formula she'd solved. Word spread again, not through news or social feeds, just whisper to whisper, traveler to traveler. Programmers came, not for code, but for clarity. Farmers visited, curious about how she'd made numbers sound like prayer. Even musicians came, recording the hum of her algorithm mixed with the crackle of the fire, calling it Rain on Copper Dreams. Harper never charged a dime. She said the payment was presence. If you listened to it long enough, she'd tell newcomers you start to hear your own breath slow down to the rhythm of the land. On her 10th winter in Bitter Gulch, Harper grew frail. She knew her time was near, and she wanted to leave something more than a machine. She read the last caretaker ledgers, Silas, Ruth, Tom, and began typing their words into a small wooden terminal she'd wired herself. It glowed soft amber, humming like the quiet heartbeat of the room. Her final line of code was simple. Wealth of world to forgets her mind world, patience pays in time, not coin, she smiled. Pressed enter, and the Ledger House lights flickered once, then steady. The old bell rang outside just once, like a thank you. After Harper passed, storms came heavy. They washed the roads out. But somehow the Ledger House stood, powered not by wires or grids, but by that small hum she'd left behind. Visitors found the terminal still glowing, playing faint voices from long ago, the voices of Silas, Ruth, Tom, even Harper herself, all woven together like wind across ages. It wasn't technology exactly, it was memory, turned electric, a living ell of everyone who'd sat by that fire and learned to breathe again. Folks started calling it the whispering machine. Now and then, wanderers would view its sound, soft static, rain hiss, faint drawls overlapping in harmony, and posted online under titles like Cowboy, Wisdom in the Rain, or Stillness Loop, Ledger House Mix. Strangest thing was, no matter how modern the remix, the heart of it stayed the same. A steady rhythm reminding people to slow their pulse and listen. And so the lesson rode on, hitching a ride through fiber optic trails and wireless winds, reaching ears that had never seen a prairie sky but could feel its wideness all the same. No one claimed authoring. There was no brand, no logo, just the old phrase that faded in and out between the static like a mantra carved into rain itself. You can't own patience, but you can share it till the world learns to breathe again. The Ledger House still stands, they say, though maps don't mark it.
Some nights, if you're driving through an empty stretch of desert highway and you turn the radio dial slow, you might catch a whisper buried between stations, the sound of crackling fire, and a voice older than memory saying, evening traveler, sit a spell, let the storm talk first. And in that moment, with the world rushing past like a runaway train, you'll remember what every soul before you learned in Bitter Gulch, that real wealth ain't counted. It felt like warmth in the bones after a long cold ride, or the hush that follows a story told true. The rain keeps falling. The bell keeps swinging. The lesson never ends.
Years later, and long after Harper Lane's stillness algorithm had become folklore whispered in digital corners, a man named Elias Boone found himself following the same trail of ghosts and echoes. Elias wasn't a man of computers nor finance. He was a carpenter from a town that didn't make the news, one of those slow-ticking places where time still bothered to stretch its legs, but he carried a quiet burden. Debt stacked higher than his rafters, promises broken under the weight of bills and bad seasons. He'd built half the houses in his county, but couldn't keep his own from falling apart. He'd once heard a clip, a faint voice in a YouTube recommendation titled Whispers from Bitter Gulch. It was grainy, like it'd been recorded in another century. The speaker tone had a kindness to it, soft but firm, like the sound of old hands mending rope. It said, you can't measure peace by the size of your paycheck. It measured by how long you could sit still without reaching for something. That line hooked him deep. One morning, after losing his last client and watching his truck get towed, Elias locked the door to his workshop, slung a pack over his shoulder, and started walking. He didn't know where to. He only knew he needed to find the voice that told him to stop running. Days turned to weeks, highways turned to dirt roads, and the dirt roads turned to silence. He followed the sound of thunder one evening and found the old hill with the crooked bell tower, leaning against a backdrop of clouds and dusk. Bitter Gulch had changed again. Wildflowers growing through cracked stone, a single pine standing sentinel over the graves out back. Inside, the Ledger House still hummed. The lanterns glowed faint amber, and that strange little terminal Harper had built was still alive, whispering in loops. He stood there, soaking it in, the low hum of circuitry blending with rain and wind, a harmony older than invention itself. Elias made a small fire in the pit and just sat. Didn't say a word, didn't write a thing. The place didn't demand it, it own waited. That night, as lightning cut the horizon, the whispering machine spoke. Not through speakers, but through the air itself, a soft blend of voices that felt human and eternal all at once. Every hand that built, every heart that broken, left something worth saving. You're not there to fix what gone. You're here to remember how to build slow again. Slept by the fire, dreaming of sawdust and sunlight and the sound of nails driven with patience instead of haste. When dawn came, he found a fresh ledger open on the desk, blank but whitened. A pen sat across it, ink and ready. He hesitated, then began to write. Not words of wisdom, but plans, designs, sketches of simple things, chairs, tables, small homes that could be built with one-man hands and a week's worth of honest labor. Each blueprint bore the same mark in the corner. Quiet built, Bitter Gulch. You didn't realize it then, but those drawings would ripple out across the land. Folks from nearby towns started finding his work. Tiny, sturdy cabins tucked into forest clearings, built for reflection, not retreat. He never charged for the designs, left them scattered in cafes, libraries, and freight depots with one note attached. Build slow. Leave room for silence. Within a few years, quiet-built cabins became a quiet movement. People left the noise of cities to raise walls with their own hands. guided by his sketches, and every cabin had a single symbol carved into its doorframe, a simple open circle, meant to remind whoever crossed through that the house wasn't a place to own, but a place to pause.
Elias returned to Bitter Gulch every winter, bringing new designs, new stories. He'd sit by the fire, feeding the whispering machine's soft hum with tales of how people were remembering to slow down, to rebuild their lives plank by plank instead of paycheck by paycheck. But one winter, the old man didn't return. When travelers went looking, they found his boots sitting neatly by the fire pit, and a new ledger half filled with words unlike the ones before. They weren't designs this time, they were reflections, simple, unpolished, with deep in river water. There's no shame in starting small. A sin board, a single meal, a single hour of peace, that wealth enough for the day. People think time their enemy, but it's just a partner that don't like to be rushed. I built my first house to live in. I built my last one to leave open. Below the final line in shaky handwriting he'd written, if you're reading this, you're the next builder. Don't make the mistake I did. Don't build for applause. Build for quiet. They buried him out back next to Ruth and Tom and Harper, beneath that same old pine that had been watching over the place since the first ledger was written. And from that day forward, Bitter Gulch became something more than a stop for wanderers. It became a way of life. Architects visited to learn patience. Economists came to unlearn greed. Poets came to trade words for silence. And every one of them left their mark, another line in that endless collection of lessons that began with Silas Wren's first ink stroke. The world outside kept changing. The digital hum grew louder, the cities brighter, the nights shorter. But the whisper from Bitter Gulch never went silent. It just adapted, finding new trails, sometimes in the hum of et-ap meditation loop, sometimes in an anonymous quote passed between tired hands in subway stations. Always the same message, changing clothes but not its soul. Wealth is what remains when you stop needing more. And somewhere in the middle of the night, if the wind right, you can still hear that bell toll once across the distance, soft, slow, and sure as if the valley itself is breathing along with every soul that remembers the art of stillness. The last ledger of Mason Holt. The wind was rolling in low that evening, dragging dust and thunder down from the mesa, whispering like it carried old secrets. I remember sitting by the fire, the rain hitting the tin roof slow and steady, telling me stories older than my own memory, that when I first heard about Mason Holt, the man folks out west still called the banker who quit money. Now don't that sound like nonsense, a banker walking away from gold? But the way the story goes, it wasn't madness, it was freedom. Mason came up in a hard time, grew up working behind his daddy's general store, counting pennies like they were prayers. Folks in this town didn't have much, so what little they had, they held tight. Mason learned young that every coin had a story, every dollar a weight, and that if you weren't careful, money could start talking louder than your own conscience. But Mason was not the kind to stay small town. He had big eyes, sharp mind, and a quiet hunger that kept him studying late after the lamps went out. Went off to the city in his 20s, took up with a firm that traded in futures, steel, oil, grain, and promises. He worked himself like a mule, eating stress for breakfast, climbing faster than most men breathe. They say by 35 he had more money than a dozen lifetimes could spend. But something strange started happening. He'd wake before dawn, stare at the ceiling, and feel empty. Not the kind of empty you fill with coffee or win or praise, the kind that makes a man realize he'd been trading his soul a nickel at a time. One day, he sat in his office staring at the ticker feed, the endless scroll of numbers blinking like the pulse of the world, and it hit him. I'm watching ghosts dance. None of this is real. That was the day Mason Holt disappeared. Didn't tell a soul, didn't cash out, didn't say goodbye. He left his suit on the back of his chair and took the first train west, carrying only a satchel, a journal, and a silver watch his daddy had given him. Nobody knew where he went, not for a long while. Years later, travelers start coming through a valley between Red Rock and nowhere. They talk about a cabin near the river, half barn, half chow, where a man with eyes like winter sky lived alone. Said he'd trade you shelter and supper if you were willing to talk, really talk. Not about markets or business, but about what kept you awake at night. They said Mason had turned that cabin into a school of stillness. Folks came from all over, farmers, drifters, even a few tired traders who'd heard rumors that the banker who quit money could teach a man how to breathe again. He'd sit with him by the fire, the river humming outside, and he'd ask the same question every time. How much is enough? Most couldn't answer. Some cried, trying. Mason never judged him. He just nodded slow, like he'd heard that silence before. Told them that money wasn't evil, but it was loud, louder than wind, louder than conscience.
If you ain't careful, he'd say, it'll start speaking for you. And when that happens, partner, you ain't living no more. You're just collecting proof that you exist. Mason didn't reject wealth. He redefined it. He taught that wealth was measured by control, not quantity. Control of your mind, your habits, your fears. He'd say, if a man needs a bottle to sleep, he broke. If he needs applause to smile, he broke. And if he needs the next dollar to breathe, he the poorest soul alive. Folks would stay a week, sometimes longer. He never charged them, never asked for favors, but he made them work. Each dawn, they'd build something not for him, but for the valley. A fence, a bridge, a bench by the river. Build with your hands, he'd say, and your head'll quiet down long enough to hear truth. One trader named Connor Brooks once wrote in his diary that the old banker changed his life.
Said Mason taught him more about finance sitting under that vallow tree than all the boardrooms of Manhattan did. He made me see that compound isn't that numbers Connor wrote. It choices every habit, every sunrise you waste or use, while that the interest you're earning on your life. Word spread quiet. Folks started calling that place the Ledger of the Soul, but Mason never sought a crowd. People don't need followers, he told one young man. They need echoes. You go live what you've learned and let the sound carry it. It did. Years passed and Mason grew old. His beard went white, his hands cracked from building more cabins than any banker had a right to. But he smiled easier. He kept that silver watch by his bedside, though he never wound it anymore. Time he'd tell visitors, don't need my help to move forward. I'm just trying to move with it. One winter night, snow swallowed the hills. Mason sat by the fire alone and wrote his last entry in that journal. Folks found it years later after he was gone.
The fire had long gone cold, but the journal was untouched, waiting for whoever needed to read it most. The first line said, I spent half my life earning more, and the other half earning less. Turns out, wealth was never about addition. It was about subtraction. And below that, in faded ink, the richest man is the one who will walk away without losing himself. That cabin still stands somewhere out there, half swallowed by pine and wind. Travelers who find it say the river still sings beside it, and if you sit quiet enough, you can hear the creak of the old man chair and the slow rhythm of a pen scratching truth into paper. Maybe it's a ghost, or maybe it's just the world remembering what he taught. That money, like fire, can warm or burn, but it ain't the fire that decides. It's the hands that tend it. And if you find yourself lost in the noise, chasing more than you can carry, you might hear his voice in the wind, whispering, sit a while, partner. Count your breaths instead of your bills. One of those runs out faster, but it ain't the one you think. In the years that followed Mason Holt passing, folks tried to find out who he really was. Some said he'd left behind gold buried deep in the valley. Others swore he'd turned every dollar he owned into tools, wood, and land for strangers to deeds. But truth was simple, quiet. Mason hadn't left a fortune behind. He'd left a rhythm. That rhythm moved the people. Men and women who once measured life by digits began measuring it by peace. A woman named Clara, a widow from Amarillo, built her first small cabin beside Mason Old Riverbank. She used his notes, handwritten sketches, and words half faded in coffee stains to rebuild her life from the ground up. She wrote that she'd once thought she needed to remarry or find work to survive, but sitting in that cabin through one long rainstorm, she realized what she really needed was time. She wrote, Mason's lesson wasn't about quitting money, it was about quitting the chase. Soon enough, travelers started showing up again, same as before. Some came with debts, others with broken dreams, and a few with nothing left but breath and shame.
The place had no sign, no keeper, no welcome mat, just that same open door and the slow hum of the river waiting. Each person who stayed left something behind. A carving in the table, a coin under the floorboard, a lead tacked to the post by the bed. It wasn't a shrine, it was an ongoing conversation. One letter, found years later, was from a young rancher who'd lost everything to drought and bad deals. He wrote, I thought wealth was water in the trough, but Mason made me see it was the will to dig a new well. He didn't preach about money, he preached about faith, the kind that builds when the rain don't come. Time wore the place down. Roofs sagged, weeds crept, trails washed out, but still, people came. Then, sometime in the 1970s, a man named Luther Crow found himself driving across the plains in a rusted pickup, radio broken, debts heavier than his load of scrap lumber. He was an old ranch hand who tried his luck at real estate when the oil boom came through, made a quick buck, lost it faster, spent 20 years playing tug-of-war with taxes and pride.
One night, he ran out of gas near a canyon road, rain beating hard enough to blur the horizon. He started walking, figuring, He'd find a station or a rail, whichever came first, that when he saw it a dim orange glow through the trees. He followed it, slipping and cursing through mud, till he stumbled upon an old wooden cabin half swallowed by moss. The door creaked open easy. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and ashes. On the table sat a ledger, open to a blank page, with a pen waiting like it had been expecting him. Luther laughed out loud, a rough, cracked sound. "You're a long way from Wall Street, Holt," he muttered. "Remembering the legend?" He sat down anyway, and for the first time in years, he wrote. Not contracts, not numbers, just truth. He wrote about his mistakes, the deals made out of fear, the partners he'd cheated, the nights he'd prayed for one more chance. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the words turned from confession to forgiveness. By dawn, the rain had stopped. He closed the ledger, leaned back in that old chair, and slept for 12 straight hours. When he woke, the valley was brighter. Luther stayed there for 3 weeks, mending the roof, clearing weeds, humming old tunes to the beat of his hammer. When he finally left, he didn't take a thing except the piece he'd earned. He sold the scrap metal, bought a small plot of land, and started building handcrafted chairs, each one branded underneath with a small carving. MH, he said it stood for more here. Those chairs spread across the country, not mass-produced, not advertised, but passed from one soul to another. Every sealed one found its way to someone who needed stillness more than comfort. Some ended up in hospitals, led on porches, led in offices of men too proud to admit they were tired, and that how Mason Holt's legacy grew. Not through banks or fame, but through simple objects that carried the ghost of his lesson. A journalist from Dallas once tracked the story. Following the path of the MH chairs, he found 100 of them scattered from Montana to New Mexico, each with carvings unique but familiar. He asked every owner the same question, "What it worth to you?" Not a single one answered with a dollar figure. One woman said, "It worth my first breath after a panic attack." Another man said, "It worth the day I didn't quit." A preacher whispered, "It worth silence." The journalist never finished his article. Instead, he built one of those cabins himself. See, what Mason started wasn't a movement you could trademark. It was a way of remembering. A reminder that freedom don't come from owning more. It comes from needing less. Every now and then someone new finds that cabin. They say the ledger's still there, though the ink faded near to vanishing. But if you look close in the margin of one old page, you'll see a final note in shaky handwriting. Don't try to make this place immortal. Just make it useful while you're here. And beside that, carved into the table where countless hands have rested, are the faint words, "Stop counting, start living." That's the kind of wealth Mason Holt left behind. No vault, no inheritance, just a quiet arithmetic that don't add up in banks but multiplies in hearts. When the rain starts tapping on your roof and the fire low, you might hear it too. That low hum of the river. That whisper in your own breath reminding you that money dips one kind of current and the real kind, the one worth going, runs through time, patience, and the soft miracle of staying still long enough to remember who you are decades past. And that old river valley came to be known as Holt Crossing. It never made the maps proper. No one bothered to register it, but the story found its way into whispers passed along truck stops and campfires like a parrot that changed shape depending on who told it. Some said it was haunted by Mason himself, walking the riverbank with a lantern, watching over the folks who came looking for peace. Others claimed the cabin was cursed, that those who sought fortune there found humility instead. Either way, people kept coming. By the time the 21st century rolled, Holt Crossing had nearly vanished beneath vines and rain. The roof caved, the ledger molding into dust, and the silver watch Mason only keepsake was long gone, probably buried somewhere beneath the roots of that old cedar tree. But even nature reclaimed the place. The idea of it stayed alive. See, a few of those who visited Mason Cabin had taken his message with them, not in their pockets, but in their bones. They'd passed it on without meaning to. One man taught his daughter to save peace before you save pennies. She grew up to start a foundation that helped families out of debt without drowning them in shame. Another woman, a school teacher named Miriam Holt, no relation, wrote a book called The Gentle Arithmetic of Enough. It never hit bestseller lists, but somehow it found its way into 1,000 waiting rooms and 1,000,000 hearts. She dedicated it to the man who taught us that slowing down was an act of rebellion. Years later, the cabin story reached a young entrepreneur named Cole Anders. He wasn't born rich, but he clawed his way to it. Built a tech company from nothing, sold it for millions before 30. Folks in the city called him a genius. He had a penthouse with glass walls, cars that could drive themselves, and an emptiness that technology couldn't debug. Cole was a man addicted to velocity. If he wasn't launching something, he was crashing from something. He built an empire of solutions, but deep down he knew none of them fixed the ache inside him. He'd read Miriam Holt's book one night on a flight to Tokyo, and one line burrowed into him so deep he couldn't shake it. The richest man is the one who would end his day in silence. For weeks he couldn't sleep. The hum of servers in his head, the echo of meetings, the glow of screens, all of it felt like a fever. So he did something he'd never done before. He turned everything off, sold his stock, closed his accounts, and disappeared. He spent 2 years drifting through the back roads of America, learning how to live slow. He picked apples in Vermont, fixed fences in Wyoming, poured coffee in diners that didn't take cars. One rainy evening, driving through the plains, his truck broke down near a canyon road, the same one where Luther Crow once ran out of gas nearly a century before. He followed the same path, through the same woods, and found what was left of Mate Holt cabin. Only the stone foundation and part of the chimney remained. The rest had been swallowed by moss and time, but beside the ruins, half buried in soil, was a rusted metal box. Inside it, wrapped in old cloth, was a single page of the ledger, miraculously preserved. The words were faint but readable. What you hold, you serve. What you release, serves you. Cole sat there in the rain till night fell, staring at that sentence. He'd spent his whole life holding onto power, profit, identity, and not once had he felt free. He stayed there till morning, and when the sun broke through the clouds, he made a vow. He rebuilt the cabin, not that a monument, but that a circle, no walls, no doors, just an open-air structure made of reclaimed wood and stone. He named it the Ledger House, same as the old story said, and carved the words "enough" as a direction above the entrance. People laughed at him at first. The billionaire gone mad, they said. He building shrines to minimalism. But Cole didn't care. He wasn't preaching. He was building a space for listening. He started inviting small groups, founders, teachers, farmers, doctors, to spend a week there. No phones, no Wi-Fi, no agenda, just firelight, river wind, and questions that had no stock answer. He called it compounding the quiet. Those who came left changed. Some quit their jobs. Some started farms. Some went back to their old lives, but with lighter hearts. And slowly, word spread again, same way it always had, by whispers, not headlines. Cole never took credit for any of it. When journalists came looking for a story, he just told them, "It ain't mine. It Holt." But those who knew said that he'd built something Mason would have smiled at a place where people didn't chase wealth, but remembered its real definition. Before Cole died, he wrote a letter to be sealed in that metal box beside the original ledger page. It was found years later by hikers. The last line read, "I spent a lifetime searching for the code that unlocks wealth." Turns out, it wasn't written in numbers. It was written in breath. Now, every spring, a few wanderers make their way to Holt Crossing, guided by nothing but rumor. They find the circle, sit beneath the wind, and write their own lines on wood, stone, or memory. No sermons, no brands, no hashtags, just the sound of rain hitting the river and the soft murmur of people remembering what still matters. A full heart, an honest day, and the courage to stop running. If you'll find yourself lost near that canyon and the world too loud to think, follow the sound of water and wind.
Somewhere in that quiet, beneath the ghost of rain and cedar, you'll hear a voice that's been whispering for 100 years. You don't earn peace, you uncover it. When the Ledger House turned to legend again years after Cole Anders' passing, it wasn't that it's vanished. It was because it became too quiet to be found by noise. No map led there, no website listed it. It simply existed where those who needed it most seemed to stumble upon it, like a hidden truth only the lost could see. As the story drifted into the next century, whispered through generations who'd long forgotten Mason Holt name but still felt his lesson beating beneath the skin of their lives. One of those who heard it was a boy named Rory Kane, born under the wide Wyoming sky, when rain was rare and silence came easy. His family worked cattle and fought droughts, just like most folks who clung to the stubborn edges of land that hadn't yet been tamed by cities. Rory wasn't a dreamer, not at first. He was just a good hand, steady, honest, and content to keep his boots in the dirt and his pay without his pocket.
But years have a way of stretching a man thinner than he realizes. When his father passed, the ranch debts came due, and soon Rory found himself sitting at a desk in a downtown office, working an assistant loan officer for the same bank that owned half the land he grew up raiding. It was good money, steady hours, clean clothes, and it felt like dying. He'd show up early, leave late, and count the hours like cattle, each one penned in with numbers, screens, and the low hum of machines calculating interest on lives they'd never lived. It wasn't the work that broke him, it was the distance. The further he got from the earth, the less his own heartbeat seemed to belong to him. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, Rory sat staring at the monitor. The numbers flickered like ghosts, debts, repayments, foreclosures, each one a story, each one a soul. He scrolled through the records till he found one name that caught him like a burr, Holt Crossing, parcel 7C. It was listed as abandoned, tax defaulted, unclaimed for decades, but the notes beneath it told a different story. Benchant Historic Preservation and Community used the last entry that read, "No sale, legacy protected by pipe deed." Something in him stirred, faint and familiar. He printed the page, folded it into his coat, and drove west. The drive took 2 days and a lifetime. By the time he reached the foothills, the road had turned to dust, and the air smelled like memory pine, mud, and something older than grief. He followed what looked like a kit animal trail down a slope and saw it there, the remains of the ledger house, weathered beams. Stone circle, a sea post standing like a sentinel against time. He set up camp by the river that night, didn't speak, didn't pray, just listened. And in that silence, the kind that feels alive, he realized he wasn't alone. A few hours past midnight, rain began to fall, soft at a whisper. He pulled his coat tighter, and that when he saw it, faint light glimmering beneath the soil near the circle, he brushed away the mud, and out came the same old metal box. Inside, the same page Cole had left, the same line, now almost gone. What you hold, you serve. What you release serves you, but beneath it, on the back of the page, someone, maybe Cole, maybe another, had written a sealed word crack. Rory stayed there for 3 days, didn't try it that way, it just felt right. He rebuilt the fire pit, fixed the post, cleared the weeds. By the third morning, he realized he hadn't thought about money once. He hadn't checked his phone, hadn't planned his next move. He just was. When he finally left, he didn't take the paper, didn't take the box, but he took the idea, and that's how the Holt Foundation for Honest Finance began. Now, don't mistake the name. It wasn't no charity, and it sure wasn't a bank. Rory built it out of his own pocket, small and quiet, starting with one office in Cheyenne. They didn't give loans, they gave lessons. Folks came in with debt, fear, shame, and left with plans, understanding, and the kind of strength that grows when you realize you're not owned by numbers anymore. He made sure every meeting ended with a story. Sometimes it was Mason, sometimes Cole, sometimes his own. And he always ended with the same words: the math of life don't start with dollars.
Starts with decisions. Soon enough, people stopped calling it an office and started calling it the ledger room. It spread across the plains like a rumor with roots, small gatherings of farmers, teachers, mechanics, and dreamers who gut needed to remember that wealth was built in time, not haste. Years later, when Rory was asked by a reporter what success looked like to him, he smiled and said, "A man sitting by the fire with his bills paid, his belly full, and his heart still open. Everything else is garnish." He never sold the story, never trademarked it, never put Mason name on billboards. But every spring, he'd drive out to Holt Crossing and leave a hand-carved token by the river, a coin made of oak, with one wed burned into wood enough. They say if you visit that place today, the water still runs the same. The air still hums like a hymn, and on the nights when the storm rolls in just right, if you listen close, you can hear 3 voices, one calm, one young, and one timeless, all speaking the same truth that outlived every market and every man. Gold fades, names fade.
But the quiet stays, and maybe that's what Mason was after all along, not a legacy written in ledgers, but a freedom that could outlast the sound of coins hitting the floor. So if you find yourself counting things that don't count, or losing sleep over paper that won't remember your name, take a breath. Sit by your own fire and remember Mason, Holt, Cole, Anders, and the boy from Wyoming who proved that wealth ain't measured by what you keep, but by how light your hands feel when you finally let go. Years rolled by like tumbleweeds through time, and the Holt Foundation became less a business and more a pilgrimage. Nobody really knew who ran it anymore. There were no executives, no shareholders, no marble floors or mission statements. It was just passed from one honest soul to another, each leaving their own quiet mark like a footprint on the trail. What started at a dusty office in Cheyenne turned into a network of tiny wooden outposts scattered across the countryside, each one built simple, a table, 2 chairs, and a stove. Folks call them firelight banks, where the currency was stories and the interest rate was patience. Somewhere down the line, the foundation caught the ear of a woman named Evelyn Shaw, a ranch-born mathematician who'd spent her best years in city towers crunching numbers for people who'd forgotten how to live by M. She'd once said that numbers were her language, but one day she realized she'd been speaking them so long she'd forgotten what they meant. Profit, debt, equity, words that used to thrill her now tasted like ash. When her mother passed, Evelyn took her inheritance, barely enough to buy an old truck and a few acres of forgotten prairie, and drove west just to breathe where the horizon still had room to stretch. That when she heard about Holt Crossing through a radio show barely picking up static, which that old cowboy caller told the host about a place where the ledgers don't lie, 'cause they ain't written in ink, they're written in time. Evelyn followed the signal. She found one of those firelight banks outside a ghost town called Alder Ridge. The door was unlocked inside, just like the story said, 2 chairs, a stove, and a single book on the table. The first page read, "This ain't a record, it a reckoning." Right on to what matters. She stayed for days, then weeks, fixing up the place, adding shelves for the folks who came by to leave their own journals. Each entry told a different kind of wealth. The mother, who paid off her house after 30 years. The boy, who learned to save for a guitar instead of a phone. The widower, who forgave his son debt, not because he had to, but he finally understood that forgiveness itself was profit. Evelyn started collecting those stories, writing them into a book she called The Quiet Ledger. It was never meant for print, but copies spread like wildfire. High school teachers used it in economics classes, preachers quoted it in sermons, and even in corporate managers, those who hadn't completely lost their soul, started putting it on their desks beside the calculators. But the more the world tried to market the idea, the more Evelyn resisted. She'd seen how everything pure eventually gets bought, packaged, and sold, so she built a rule. Anyone who used the ledger lessons had to give something back. Not money, but time, a weekend of teaching, an hour of listening, a meal shared with someone who had nothing.
Johnson, that Dupuy survived another generation. One autumn, when the wind was sharp enough to slice the sky in two, Evelyn drove back to the original Holt Crossing. What was left of the Ledger house stood silent but proud, reclaimed wood and wildflowers growing where the walls had been. She sat by the river, watched the sun fall, and thought about the strange arithmetic of the ditch. You realized something then, that every soul who'd come before had built not but a place, but a rhythm. Mason, Cole, Rory, they hadn't been legends. They were just men who'd listened when the world tried to shout. They traded noise for presence, greed for gratitude, speed for stillness, and that trade had compounded across a century until even strangers could feel the interest accrue in their hearts. She left her own offering before heading home, a small brass compass engraved with 4 words that had guided her since the day she left the city. North is not forward. Years later, a young boy found it barefoot fishing by the river. Didn't know the story, didn't care really.
But he turned that compass over in his hand, saw the words, and for reasons he couldn't name, decided to take the long way home that day. And maybe that all the Holt legacy bed needed to be. Not a lesson, but a seed. 100 years after Mason Holt sat by that same fire and first thought about what money could mean if it didn't own a man, his spirit still wandered those hills. Folks who camped near the crossing said that when the rain hit the tin roof of the old cabin ruins just right, it sounded like coins dropping into a bucket. And if you listened close, you could hear a laugh in the rhythm. It was not the bitter kind of laugh. It was the kind that comes when a man finally understands the joke time been telling all along, that all our rushing, hoarding, and worrying were never the taint. The taint was the pause between all. The place where a man stops counting long enough to feel rich in breath. And maybe that's what the old cowboy meant when he said, "River don't remember who dammed it, but it never stops flowing." If Mason could have seen it now, Evelyn Ledger's Rory Foundation, cold circle of silence, the stories traded a warmth around firelight, he would have smiled that quiet, patient smile of his, not proud, not boastful, just grateful that the seed he planted in solitude had bloomed into something mighty enough to shade souls he'd never meet. For that's the truest kind of compound, the one the cowboys and dreamers and wanderers always knew, a fortune that grows in the hearts of others even long after you've gone to dust. And so the rain keeps falling steady and eternal over Holt Crossing. Somewhere in that rhythm between thunder and stillness, you can still hear it, the faint scratch of a pen on paper, the hush of a man learning again how to listen to himself. That's where the real ledger lives now, not in ink nor in stone, but in the breath of anyone who paused by the fire to whisper. Enough. By the time Evelyn Compass passed through a dozen hands, the story of Holt Crossing had stretched beyond the borders of the plains. It was no longer just a tale whispered by firelight. It was a quiet current in the world bloodstream. People didn't speak Mason Holt's name often, but they felt him every time they turned off the noise, set down their phones, or chose to build instead of buy. One winter morning, under a sky that Ludwig tarnished silver, a drifter named Cal Whitmore found himself walking the same road that led through those hills. He wasn't a preacher or a scholar or a man of wealth. He was a failed musician with nothing left but a cracked guitar, $2, and a restless kind of sorrow. He'd spent most of his life chasing applause, the kind that fades quicker than it echoes. But when his last show ended in silence instead of cheers, he decided to alter the only direction left, and the choice commode heightened somewhere between lost and forgotten. Duck into an old structure for shelter, a circle of beams, a few stones, and a roof patched by time. He didn't know it yet, but he was sitting in the bones of the Ledger House. He built a fire, warmed his hands, and knit carvings on the wood names, dates, words half-faded but still alive. Enough complete. Listen, each one looked like it had been written by someone who'd come to the same place for the same reason, to stop running. He reached into his coat, pulled out his last page of lyrics, and stared at the smudged ink. They were about fame, heartbreak, and the other empty trophies he'd been collecting. He tore it in half, tossed it into the flames, and sat there humming a tune he didn't know he remembered. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed, and something in him had too. He found a smooth stone by the river, took his pocket knife and carved 3 words into it before laying it beside the ruins. Play for peace. He left the mountains that day, not been a man looking to be heard, but the one ready to listen. Over the years, Cal wandered from town to town, playing songs for folks who couldn't afford tickets, writing tunes that spoke about quiet instead of noise. His music never topped charts, but people shared it anyway. One of his songs, The Ledger in the River, became a kind of anthem for wanderers who'd given up on speed, and that how the legend turned to melody. They say you can still hear that song on nights when the rain falls soft and the wind hums through the canyons. No stage, no crowd, just the earth singing back the truth it always known. Wealth is what you can leave without losing yourself. Years later, a young girl named Nora found Cal's record in a thrift store bin. She was 13, poor and angry at the world for giving her nothing but dust. The song wasn't clean, it hissed, cracked, and skipped, but there was something in his voice, a kind of steady warmth that wrapped around her like an old blanket. She played that record every night until it broke, and by then she didn't need it anymore. She'd learned the words by heart. No. Nora grew up, built a small life in a big city, and worked Dan, a clerk at a pawn shop. One day a man came in to sell a brass compass, the same one Evelyn Shaw had left by the river. The words, "North is not forward," had worn smooth with age. The man didn't know what it was worth, so she gave him $10 and kept it. That night she couldn't sleep. She stared at that compass for hours, until the pull of curiosity dragged her into the rain. She didn't know where she was going, but she started walking west. It took her 3 weeks to find Holt Crossing, though she didn't know its name. She'd have followed the wind, the way lost things do. When she reached the clearing, the air smelled like stories. She sat where the fire once burned, pulled out her notebook, and began to write. Not songs, not plans, just thoughts. She wrote about the noise of the city, about how every ad screamed louder than her heartbeat, about how she missed seeing stars. She wrote till her hands cramped, till the rain bled her ink into a blur. Then he carved a line into the wood of the circle and left the compass beside it. The words she wrote read, "I came me to get rich in silence." The next morning she left without looking back. What she didn't know was that someone zoned would find those words 10 years later, and someone after them 10 years after that. The Ledger had long since stopped being a place. It had become a pulse, a rhythm shared by people who remembered that progress was not the same thing as peace. And so Mason Holt's circle continued. Not been a monument, not been a myth, but in a reminder that somewhere, out beyond the noise and the neon, the fire still burns for those who wander far enough to see it. The rain never stopped visiting that place. Maybe it couldn't help itself. Maybe it just liked the company of quiet souls. And if you'll find yourself sitting by a campfire hearing the rhythm of drops hitting tin and feel your chest loosen for the first time in years, well, maybe that the Ledger's speaking through time, whispering the oldest lesson there is. You can't take peace from the world. You can only remember it. Years passed, and Nora words, those carved into the wood at Holt Crossing, became part of the place, quiet scripture. Travelers came less to find wealth and more to forget the chase for it, funds. Mason Holt's circle continued, not then a monument, not then a myth, but then a reminder that somewhere, outbound the noise and the neon, the fire still burns for those who wander far enough to see it. The rain never stopped visiting that place. Maybe it couldn't help itself. Maybe it just liked the company of quiet souls. And you will find yourself sitting by a campfire, hearing the rhythm of drops hitting tin, and feel your chest loosen for the first time in years. Well, maybe that the ledger's speaking through time, whispering the oldest lesson there is. You can't take peace from the world. You can only remember it. Years passed, and Nora words, those carved into the wood at Holt Crossing, became part of the place, quiet scripture. Travelers came less to find wealth and more to forget the chase for it. They came to remember breath, to trade their noise for stillness, and to sit with the kind of peace you don't earn, you just notice. The world outside spun faster than then. Markets climbed, fell, and rebuilt overnight. Machines learned to think, to speak, to sell, to seduce. Cities no longer slept, they hummed like restless hearts, afraid of silence. Yet somehow, through all that acceleration, the legend of the ledger lingered. Folks began to tell stories about a sanctuary of slowing, a mythic place where money couldn't buy, and mission and words lost their sharpness. And though nobody ever claimed ownership, Holt Crossing changed hands more times than gold had put. Not through deeds or titles, but through memory. It was their old writer named Jonah Pike who gave that memory shape again. He'd been a financial journalist, once sharp, sarcastic, and always ready to slice through hypocrisy with a pen dipped in acid. But years of exposés, scandals, and broken truths had drained him. He said the thing about exposing corruption was that it never ended. You could cut off one head and two more would grow in its place. So he quit. Packed a sealed typewriter, left the city, and drove until the roads forgot where they were going. He ended up, of course, near Holt Crossing. The place wasn't rocked anymore, just a clearing, a handful of stones, and a quiet river humming the same tune it had 100 years before. Jonah sat there, built himself a small fire, and for the first time in decades didn't write for anyone. He just listened. He began keeping a journal, not to publish, not to prove, but to process. He wrote about the things numbers couldn't say, the way a sunrise could erase debt from the soul, the way silence could pay back years of noise, the way the smallest act of gratitude could feel like a dividend on life itself. He called that notebook the long interest. And without meaning to, Jonah became the fourth keeper of Holt's story. He started teaching wanderers who stopped by truckers, hikers, broken folks from every walk how to balance more than their budgets. He'd show them how to measure a day not by output, but by alignment. Listen to It's all about the things numbers couldn't say, the way a sunrise could erase debt from the soul, the way silence could pay back years of noise, the way the smallest act of gratitude could feel like a dividend on life itself. He called that notebook the long interest. And without meaning to, Jonah became the fourth keeper of Holt's story. He started teaching wanderers who stopped by truckers, hikers, broken folks from every walk how to balance more than their budgets. He'd show them how to measure a day not by output, but by alignment. How to turn a to-do list into a B list. Every ledger, he'd tell them two sides, what you owe and what you own. But the real math of living is this. The moment you start serving what you owe to yourself, your peace, your rest, your truth, you stop working for a debt that was never yours to pay. He'd say it slow, like rain sliding down 10 when he passed. Years later, his journal was left open by the river. The last page was blank except for one line written at the top. The interest keeps compounding as long as someone's still listening. That notebook disappeared after the next storm, but the idea didn't. People started coming from all over to leave their own entries behind. Pages written on receipts, napkins, bark, each one telling a story about a trade they'd made. A CEO who sold his yacht to build an orchard. A widow who forgave her husband business partner after 20 years. A teenager who stopped comparing herself to screens and found her worth in words. None of it went viral, none of it needed to, because Holt Crossing wasn't a destination anymore. It was a direction. And even in the rest of the world built faster machines, bigger cities, smarter algorithms. That small circle in the hills kept humming to say truth, like a low, eternal chord beneath the noise. You could almost hear Mason Holt himself somewhere in it. That old cowboy spirit speaking through thunder and rustle. Don't mistake movement for meaning. Generated later, a historian found records of the place and tried to make sense of it. He published a book called The Ledger Myth. It became popular in colleges for a while, dissected, analyzed, debated, but he never truly understood it. He'd turned the campfire into a case study. But that's the funny thing about the quiet. It don't need to defend itself. It just waits. The legend skipped the scholars and went straight to the hearts of those who needed it. Factory workers, farmers, single mothers, dreamers, people who didn't need a degree to understand that peace is profit.
Somewhere, an old trucker carried a faded coin on his dash with one word enough. Somewhere, a teacher ended every class by whispering the math of life don't start with dollars. Somewhere, a kid with too much weight on his shoulders found an old compass in a thrift store and traced the words north is not forward and smiled. And in a way only time understands, all those small scattered acts linked back to that one man by the fire a century ago, Mason Holt, who'd chosen to sit still long enough to see that the world was rich already. No corporation, no government, no algorithm would own that kind of wealth because you can't copyright clarity. You can only pass it along, and so the story goes on quietly, gently, endlessly. Somewhere right now, under a rainy sky, someone's sitting by a fire thinking about all the things they thought they needed and smiling cause they realize they already have M. They don't know Holt's name, they don't need to, they just feel the ledger evening out inside them and the fire crackles like it always has, whispering through the night,
you were never poor. You Jote forgot how rich stillness can be. When the next dawn rose over the prairie, the mist rolled in thick, soft, the breath of memory. That when the next traveler came, a young man named Thomas Reed, though most folks later got caught him Reed. He was the kind of man built for a century that moved too fast, quick with numbers, quicker with opinions, and always 2 steps ahead of his own heart. He'd made his living behind glowing screens, trading seconds for cents, watching charts like a preacher watches prophecy. But after years of hustling through digital storms, he started feeling like his life was a mile wide and an inch deep. The money had come. Oh, it came easy enough, but peace? That stayed hiding like a coyote under moonlight. One night, sitting in his high-rise apartment, Reed caught sight of his reflection in the window. He didn't see pride there, didn't see success, just exhaustion, hollow and endless. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet click, like a key turning in an old door. So he left.
Sold off most of his things, kept a duffer, and hit the road with no destination. Only a compass he'd found at a roadside stall. He didn't know the words engraved on its back. Not yet, but when his thumb brushed over the worn brass, he swore he felt a pulse there, faint but steady. Weeks later, his wandering led him up an unmarked dirt path. He wasn't sure why he took it. Maybe curiosity, maybe fate. But as the road bent west, the air changed. He heard a river before he saw it, smelled the faint scent of smoke. When he reached the clearing, the remains of a fire still glowed faint orange, and in the center of that warmth was a small pile of offering stones, carved with words, bits of parchment, an old coin with enough etched deep. Something inside him recognized the rhythm of it, like he'd been in before in another life. He sat down, pulled out his notebook, and wrote, "I have chased numbers. I have chased noise. I am ready to listen." The pen stopped. The world didn't.
For 3 days he stayed silent, living off river water and canned beans, sleeping under the slow wheel of the stars. On the 3rd night, he dreamed of a man sitting by that same firehead low, boots worn, eyes kind, but weather met. The old man looked at him through the smoke and said, "Boy, you can't outspend emptiness, but you can outlast it if you sit still long enough." Reed woke with a kind of peace that don't have a reason. He understood somehow that the man in his dream wasn't a ghost. It was a memory of all who'd come before. Holt, Cole, Evelyn, Jonah, Cal, Nora, each of them still lingering, not then spirits, but the lessons stitched into the land like old roots. He there the handful of river stones and built a small circle where the fire had been. Then he wrote a single sentence in his ledger before leaving, "The return on patience is infinite." That how it always went at Holt Crossing. Nobody stayed forever. They came, they left something, and they carried something new away. A piece of stillness they'd spend the rest of their life trying not to lose. Years later, Reed found himself back in the city, but he was a different man. He opened a cafe on the edge of town, a quiet place called The Crossing. The walls were lined with notebooks left by customers, all blank except for the first line, which read, "Write what you're not saying." There was no Wi-Fi, no uke, no rush, just coffee, light, and quiet conversation. People came not because they needed caffeine, but because they needed to remember what slow felt like. Some nights, Reed would close early and sit by the window, watching rain paint ripples across the glass. He'd think about that compass still tucked in his pocket, the brass nearly worn smooth now. Sometimes he'd take it out and read the words again. North is not forward. He finally understood what it meant. It wasn't about dejuring, it was about alignment, about choosing the kind of life that moved with your soul instead of dragging it behind you. The cafe grew famous without it trying to. Journalists wrote about it, influencers tried to imitate it, entrepreneurs offered to buy it. Reed refused everyone. Reed learned the cost of saying yes to the wrong kind of wealth. When he died quietly, peacefully, with the compass on his nightstand, his niece inherited the cafe. On the day of his funeral, rain poured like it was blessing the ground itself. After the service, she unlocked the cafe, lit a candle, and found a note taped to the counter in Reed handwriting. You can't keep peace by holding it. You keep it by passing it along. She left the door open that night, even as the storm rolled in. And through that open door came a young couple, soaking wet and lost. They sat by the candle, warmed their hands, and found the notebooks on the wall. The woman smiled and wrote the first words that came to her. We stopped there for shelter, found something better. That, too, became part of the ledger. No one knew the exact moment the Holt legacy faded from story into silence, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the best stories end by becoming the air we breathe. The river kept flowing, the compass kept passing, and the rain kept singing the same tune it always had. If you listen real close on a quiet night, you might hear it yourself. The sound of coins that aren't coins, wealth that ain't wealth, and an old cowboy laughing in the distance saying you done it, partner. You remembered. Years later, the cafe became a kind of crossroads. No sign out front, no menu inside, just the faint smell of roasted beans and rain on old wood. Folks who found it never really planned to. They'd just sort of arrive, usually when life had stripped them down to bone and question. There were no lectures there, no business cards swapped, no forced smiles, only quiet, only warmth, the kind that don't sell but stays. The regulars would talk about money now and then, sure, but never about getting rich. They talked about the weight of it, how it pulled at people like a tide that never rests. And every now and then, one of them would look up at the compass Reed had hung over the counter and say, maybe that old thing right. Maybe North ain't forward. Then they'd smile, finish their drink, and go back to building whatever quiet life they could. One night, near closing, a man came in out of the rain. He was soaked through, hair matted to his face, the kind of tired you don't fix with sleep. He looked around, saw the candlelight flicker, and said to Reed's niece, "Don't suppose you're still serving?" She poured him a cup, slid it across the counter, and nodded. He drank slow, staring at nothing. Then he said,
I heard about this place from a trucker down south. Said folks come to forget what chasing got him. She smiled. You heard right.
He pulled something from his pocket. A small notebook, edges frayed. He flipped through pages filled with columns, calculations, and half-erased dreams. Used to run a company, he said, didn't even mean to. Just started building one thing after another till it owned me. He looked up, eyes like burnt-out lanterns. Now I can't even sit still without feeling broke. She didn't answer, just nodded toward the wall of blank notebooks, their room for another story. He sat there till the rain stopped, writing in silence. When he left, he tore out the last page and placed it under his cup. Later, she unfolded it and read, "The hardest thing I earned was permission to rest." She smiled, folded it again, and placed it in a wooden box behind the counter. That box filled slowly over the years letters from strangers who'd found themselves by losing what they thought they needed. Every one of them was a deposit, not of money, but of meaning. Sometimes on quiet nights when the power flickered, she'd light a lantern and read through those pages aloud to the walls. As the wind about heavy with rain would sound almost like applause. She never expanded the cafe, though investors begged her to. They saw potential, but she saw peace, and peace don't scale. The world tried to pull her back into the current, but she stayed anchored. Because by then, she'd learned the same thing Mason Holt had learned sitting by his first fire so long ago. The richest man is the one who knows when to stop digging. Eventually, she grew old. Her hands shook, her hair silvered, and her days slowed to a rhythm softer than a lullaby. Later, she nudged P. Later, she unfolded it and read, "The hardest thing I earned was permission to rest." She smiled, folded it again, and placed it in a wooden box behind the counter. That box filled slowly over the years letters from strangers who'd found themselves by losing what they thought they needed. Every one of them was a deposit, not of money, but of meaning. Sometimes on quiet nights when the power flickered, she'd light a lantern and read through those pages aloud to the walls. And the wind out heavy with rain would sound almost like applause. She never expanded the cafe, though investors begged her to. They saw potential, but she saw peace, and peace don't scale. The world tried to pull her back into the current, but she stayed stayed anchored, because by then she'd learned the same thing Mason Holt had learned sitting by his first fire so long ago. The richest man is the one who knows when to stop digging. Eventually she grew old, her hands shook, her hair silvered, and her days slowed to a rhythm softer than a lullaby. One evening near the end, she locked the cafe door, poured herself a final cup, and sat in the corner booth of that old seat. On the table she placed that compass, the one that had passed from hand to hand for over a century. It no longer pointed north, the needle had rusted in place, but it didn't matter. Its message had outlived the metal. She took a deep breath and whispered, "North ain't forward, but I'm heading home." She left that night quietly, with the candle going out in a room already filled with warmth. The next morning, a young man who delivered beans to the cafe found the door unlocked and the cup still half full. He didn't know her story, didn't know Reed, didn't know Holt, but he felt something in the air, something like peace. He sat down, looked around the quiet cafe, and noted a note taped under the counter. It read, "If you're reading this, you're next. Keep it open, keep it slow." And so he did. The cafe never changed much after that. The names of the owners did, the faces did, but the air stayed the same, thick with rain, light with forgiveness.
Some say it still stands somewhere between roads you can't find on maps, waiting for whoever ready to lay down their burdens for a spell. They say that if you listen close enough, you'll hear the faint hum of an old tune playing through the floorboards, Cal Whitmore's song, "The Ledger and the River." And if you stay till the embers die, you might hear a whisper to riding the rhythm of the rain. You can't outspend emptiness, but you can outlast it if you sit still long enough. The compass still sits on that counter. Nobody dares to clean it. It just waits, like all good things do, for the next lost soul to find their way in.
Some leave money by the cup, others leave words, but all leave lighter, and the rain keeps falling, gentle and endless, over the hills, the river, and the quiet legacy of a man who once chose stillness over gold, and in doing so, minted a kind of wealth that outlived time itself. Years bled into decades, and the world outside that cafe windows turned sharper, louder, and lonelier. Machines spoke for men, and men forgot the sound of their own silence. But somehow, that place endured. Not that a brand, not that a business, but at a pulse. The old sign above the door still read, "The Crossing," though most of the letters had long since faded, and the O looked like it might fall any day now. Yet people still came. Not 'cause it promised answers, but 'cause it didn't. It became a place where success stories began to unwind. Traders, founders, dreamers, and wanderers alike all came to confess their noise. They arrived thinking they'd lost everything, but they always left realizing they'd only been losing themselves. And every story that crossed those worn tapes somehow bent back to the same quiet lesson. Peace isn't earned, it remembered. One winter night, long after the cafe last cup had cooled, a man in a long coat stepped through the door. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. He had that look of someone who'd burned too bright for too long. His name was Amos Crane, a venture capitalist whose life had been measured in exits, returns, and balance sheets. He'd built empires, then sold them for more than entire towns would make in a lifetime. Yet, for all his success, he hadn't smiled in years. He ordered nothing, said nothing, just stood by the counter looking at the compass. The young woman tending bar that night, the fifth keeper since Reed and East, didn't ask who he was. She'd learned long ago that every stranger in the crossing carried their own storm. She simply nodded toward the far corner booth, the same one way the founder once sat decades before. Amos made his way there, slow, and if each step weighed more than gold. He sat down, leaned back, and watched the rain paint trembling rivers across the glass. When the silence got heavy enough to speak, he whispered, "I made a fortune selling speed. Every app, every deal, every company faster, faster, faster." And now I can't remember what stillness sounds like. The barista didn't reply. She didn't have to. After a long while, Amos reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he drew a Sid coin, tarnished and smooth from time. Across its face were the same letters that had passed through 100 hands since Holt himself had struck it in a moment of clarity. "Enough. I don't know how this found me," he said. "Bought the old desk at auction. found it inside a drawer. Guess it mine for now. He placed it on the table, and the candlelight caught the edges, glowing like embers from an old fire. That night, Amos didn't sleep. He sat there to dawn, thinking about every face he'd passed on his climb upward, every moment he'd traded for another dollar, every friendship that turned into a transaction. When the sun finally rose, the rain stopped, and the window cleared yet enough for him to see his reflection again, older, quieter, but somehow lighter. He picked up the coin, turned it once in his palm, and then left it beside his cup. Before walking out the door, he looked at the barista and said softly, "Tell whoever cuts next, they don't owe the world every piece of themselves." She nodded. "I'll tell him Amos walked east that morning and never came back." But a few months later, someone sent a letter addressed only to the crossing. Inside was a note and a photograph and image of Amos standing beside a small community library he'd built in a desert town far from any city lights. The note read, "Finally built something that doesn't need to grow. Thank you." Beneath his signature was a faint drawing of the coin, its message still the same. That letter was framed and hung beside the door. Travelers still see it when they come in, usually dripping wet, tired, and carrying their last thread of faith. They stare at it for a long time, whisper something to themselves, and order their coffee black. The legend of Holt Crossing became folklore by then. Some said the land itself blessed that cafe, that every person who found their way there did so because the wind remembered their name. Before walking out the door, he looked at the barista and said softly, "Tell whoever cuts next, they don't owe the world every piece of themselves." She nodded. "I'll tell him Amos walked east that morning and never came back." But a few months later, someone sent a letter addressed only to the crossing. Inside was a note and a photograph, an image of Amos standing beside a small community library he'd built in a desert town far from any city lights. The note read, "Finally built something that doesn't need to grow. Thank you." Beneath his signature was a faint drawing of the coin, its message still the same. That letter was framed and hung beside the door. Travelers still see it when they come in, usually dripping wet, tired, and carrying their last thread of faith. They stare at it for a long time, whisper something to themselves, and order their coffee black. The legend of Holt Crossing became folklore by then. Some said the land itself blessed that cafe, that every person who found their way there did so because the wind remembered their name. Others said it was coincidence or gravity of a different kind, the pull of a truth too deep to die. Whatever it was, the crossing did proof that wealth didn't come from abundance. It came from unlending enough. Late in her years, the barista, the one who'd met Amos, started keeping a small journal like Jonah Pike once did. She'd jot down the phrases she overheard that hit at lightning. Things like, "Peace ain't quiet, it's clarity. Money don't talk, but it sure can drown out true gratitude, just profits you already earned. Stillness is the one asset that compounds forever." When she ran out of space, she left that notebook on the counter. Same made those before her. It wasn't till her last winter that she added one more line to the end of the book, right beneath the list of strangers turned pilgrims. If you find this story, it's already yours. Spend it wisely. After that, the lights went out one final time, and the crossing stood empty through the next storm. Windows frosted, chairs their dust, and the compass hung still. But come spring, when the thaw returned, the door creaked open once more. No hand, no key, but the soft surrender of wood and wind. And if you listened real careful, you could almost hear footsteps echoing through time. Mason, Jonah, Reed, Amos, all of them walking the same long road, one that didn't lead forward or back, but inward. That's how the legend lived, not in walls, but in the pause between heartbeats. And when the world outside roared louder, that quiet little place on the edge of nowhere whispered the only truth that then mattered. Wealth ain't found in motion, it found in meaning. Time drifted on like an old river, and the crossing began to fade from maps, but never from memory. You couldn't find it with a GPS or a search bar, you had to be lost first. That was the toll. The entry fee wasn't money, but surrender. Those who stumbled upon it usually did so after something inside them broke, or maybe something deeper started to heal. A young woman named Clara James was one of them. She'd been a financial analyst in a world that never stopped refreshing. Her days were stock tickers, her nights were caffeine and regret. When she lost her job in a round of layoffs, she called it bad luck. But in truth, she'd been losing herself long before the company left. She took her savings, what little was left, and decided to drive west. She didn't know where she was heading, only that she needed space, air, and maybe a bit of forgiveness. Days turned into weeks, and she started writing notes to herself on gas receipts. Stop trying to outrun stillness. You can't budget your way out of emptiness. Then one rainy afternoon, her car broke down on a narrow stretch of road. No service, no tow trucks, just the endless rhythm of rain against the windshield. She got out, grabbed her coat, and started walking. After an hour, she saw the faint flicker of light through the mist, a candle in a window steady as a heartbeat. She followed it and found herself standing before a crooked sign that read The Crossing. The door creaked open like it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air smelled of earth and old wood, and the low hum of rain on the roof filled the silence between heartbeats. No one else was there. Just a pot of coffee, still warm, and a compass hanging over the counter. She poured herself a cup, sat down, and let the quiet swallow her. It wasn't loneliness, it was peace disguised to absence. She didn't realize she was crying until the first tear hit the tail. That night, she found the ledger, the one every keeper had added to. The first page was dated nearly a century A. Mason Holt found gold in the ground, found purpose in the pause. She flipped through the entries, read calm words, aimless letter, the barista final note, all of them ordinary people who'd stopped long enough to remember what mattered. By the time she reached the final page, she was smiling. The last words written were simple: "You're next." She stayed 3 days, fixed the leaky roof, brewed new coffee, cleaned the dust off the compass. When she finally left, she took nothing, just a notebook filled with words she didn't know she'd needed to write. 2 years later, Clara opened a small community school on the outskirts of a town most maps forgot. She called it Stillwater Hall. There were no tuition fees, no grades, just lessons in patience, work, and value. She taught kids about money, sure, but not in the way she used to. She taught Em that wealth was not what you kept. It was what you could walk away from and still feel whole. Farmers sent their children there, truckers dropped off donations, artists stopped by to paint the river that wound behind it. And every now and then, a stranger would come, sitting at the back of the class, listening like they'd been wandering a long time just to find that place. She never asked what they came from. She just smiled and said, "You can stay as long as you need." One spring, a box arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was an old brass compass, still rusted but somehow alive, and a note that read, "For the next traveler. It points nowhere but leads seed." Clara cried when she saw it. She hung it above the door of Stillwater Hall, right where the morning light caught it. And she stood there, she realized what the crossing had always been. Not a place, but a pattern. A quiet legacy stitched together by lost souls who'd stopped long enough to find themselves. That night, as rain whispered across the tin roof, she lit a thin candle and sat by the window. A student asked her once what success meant. She thought about it a long while before answering. Success ain't about having everything. It's about remembering what you never needed. Years passed, and her cool grew, not by numbers, but by depth. Folks from towns over would come just to sit by the fire pit and listen to her talk about the economy of enough. Sometimes she'd pull out the ledger from the crossing and read it aloud, her voice cracking but sure. And when she got to the part where Holt first wrote about patience and stillness, she'd pause, close her eyes, and say, "That way the wealth really begins." Long after Clara was gone, the school still stood. The river behind it kept flowing. The compass still hung, and the wind still carried whispers of the same truth that had passed from mouth to mouth, from fire to rain, from one weary soul to another. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere beyond the hills, the crossing still waits, light flickering, ready for whoever needs it next. They say that if you're driving alone on a quiet night, windows down, rain tapping soft on the roof, you might catch a voice riding the thunder, a deep old cowboy drawl saying, "Don't chase more. Chase meaning that the only gold that don't run dry, and if you listen real close, you can almost hear the fire crackle after he says it, like the world itself nodding in agreement." Years after Clara's name faded from the sign above the hall, Stillwater became a kind of myth whispered along truck stops and railway diners. Travelers would pass through and tell tales of a quiet woman who taught wealth without money and peace without pause. Some thought it was folklore, others swore they'd met her, or someone like her, in a rain-soaked town that never seemed to stay in one place for long. But legends have roots, and one spring morning a man named Eli Booker came looking for those roots. He was a drifter of sorts, a carpenter with more ghosts than tools, the kind who built fine things but never stayed long enough to watch them age. He'd heard of Stillwater Hall from a letter left in an abandoned church, unsigned, yellowed but clear in prayer. If you've lost your way, build something that stands still long enough for you to hear your own breath. The directions were vague. Follow the road till the map gives up. So he did. By the third day, his truck broke down on a stretch of land where fog moved like a memory. He started walking, boots heavy with mud, heart heavier still. Just when he was ready to give up, he saw it. the glint of a rusted compass hanging over a doorway, pointing nowhere, same other. Stillwater Hall stood quiet but alive. The roof sagged, the wood creaked, but the windows still let in the kind of light that forgives. He stepped inside. The air smelled of paper and cedar. There were no people. The faint sound of the river outside and the rhythm of wind through cracked boards. On the wall hung a frame with a handwritten note. If you found this place, leave it better than you found it. And below it, a ledger. The same one that had traveled from Mason Holt Campfire to Reed Cafe to Clara Hall. Eli ran his hand along the edge, thumb brushing over the worn pages. The ink had faded, but the words still breathed. He sat there for hours, reading stories of folks who'd stopped running. When he reached the last page, he found a single line in Clara's soft handwriting. The next builder will know what to do. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lit a fire in the old stove, fixed the hinges on the door, and repaired a broken desk by the window. By dawn, Stillwater Hall had its heartbeat back. Eli stayed. He didn't call it a school anymore. He called it the Ledger House. And instead of lessons, he offered space, a chair, a table, a warm drink, and a place to set down whatever burdens people carried. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lit a fire in the old stove, fixed the hinges on the door, and repaired a broken desk by the window. By dawn, Stillwater Hall had its heartbeat back. Eli stayed. He didn't call it a school anymore. He called it the Ledger House. And instead of lessons, he offered space, a chair, a table, a warm drink, and a place to set down whatever burdens people carried. Sometimes he'd talk about money, but only vain a mirror. Thing about wealth, he'd say in his low drawl, that lick a river. You can build a dam and starve yourself, or you build a bridge and keep moving. People listened. Farmers, artists, truckers, even a few tired bankers, all found their way there. Some left cash on the table, others zod, left stories, and Eli wrote every one of them down in that same ledger, the ink mixing with the ghosts of generations before. Years went on, seasons traded places, and though the world outside screamed louder with each new invention, the inside of the Ledger House stayed steady, timeless rain on tin. Then, one autumn, a boy no older than 16 wandered in. He was thin, sharp-eyed, and carried a guitar that had seen better days. Said his name was Luke. Said he was running from debt collectors and bad deals, though not the kind with contracts. Just promises he couldn't keep. Eli gave him a bed, food, and a job fixing fences. The boy didn't talk Dutch, but every night he'd sit by the river and play the same quiet tune. One evening, Eli asked, "What that song you keep humming?" The boy looked up from his guitar. "Don't know. Came to me when I was hungry. Feels like something old." Eli nodded slow. Sounds like the river humming back to itself. Months passed, and Luke stayed. He learned how to mend wood, fix roofs, and brew coffee without burning it, and in that quiet routine, the anger in him softened into something stead our purpose. Before long, travelers started asking for him by name. "That boy who plays by the river," they'd say. "He sings about time like it's something you could hold." He'd smile, tip his hat, and tell him, "You can't hold time, you can only listen to it." Eli grew older, slower. His hands stiffened, his beard silvered. One winter night, he held Luke over by the fire and handed him the ledger. Every name in here learned the same truth, he said, his voice like gravel over wind, money just motion, meaning to stop between. Luke nodded, eyes heavy. "You leaving, old man?" Eli chuckled. "We will leave eventually." I was heading toward the still part of the stream. When the morning came, Eli was gone, his chair empty but warm, the compass laying on the tail, pointing at the window where the river shined. Luke took over the Ledger House, kept the fire burning, kept the stories going. He wrote songs about the folks who came through, songs that sounded at rain and tasted at redemption. And when he finally left years later, off to chase the next horizon, he took not the compass or the ledger, but a single page from it. On it was Eli's final note. If the world forgets stillness, sing it back to him. Luke did just that. He became a wandering troubadour, known in small towns and big cities alike as the singer of Stillwater. Folks would gather around him as he played by campfires, rain trickling off his hat brim, and his voice low like thunder rolling over empty plains. He didn't talk about riches or loss. He just sang of folks who found peace when they stopped digging for gold and started listening to their own hearts. And somewhere, through all those songs and stories, through all those quiet nights by the river or fire, the spirit of the crossing lived on changing names, changing faces, but never losing its truth. The compass rusted, the ledger filled, But the lesson kept breathing stillness ain't the end of the road, it the first step po. Years passed, dry leaves on the wind, and Luke's songs carried further than he walked. Folks said his voice could still a crowded bar, make a brawler drop his fists, or turn a train station full of restless men quieting prayer. He never called himself rich, but everywhere he went he paid in peace, and people received it at treasure. There was one night in particular when the legend turned to flesh. He found himself in a mining town half carved into the mountains. The rain had been falling 3 days straight, and the only light in miles came from a saloon called the Silver Lantern. Inside, miners played cards with hands black from coal, their laughter rough and hollow. Luke walked in, his boots leaving puddles, guitar slung across his back. The barkeep looked up and grinned. Ain't seen a drifter with a tune in a long time. You any good? Luke smiled slow. Good ain't mine to say, but I reckon I can make the rain sound different. He took a seat by the fire and started strumming. The melody was simple, the kind you feel before you hear. His voice rolled low, talking more than singing. We dig for something in this life. Some dig for gold, I dig for God. Some just dig a hole trying to forget what they buried their peace. By the second verse, the room had gone still. Cards hung midair, glasses half raised. Even the fire seemed to lean in low. He sang of men who traded days for dollars till both ran dry, of men who carried families on tired backs and still found time to dream, of a river that never asked where you'd been, only that you sit a while and listen. When the song ended, no one clapped. They just sat there, staring into the fire like it might answer something. Luke tipped his hat, stood, and started toward the door. A miner caught his arm. Where'd you learn to sing like that? Luke smiled. From the quiet he left for dawn, but the song stayed. By weekend, the miners had written down the lyrics and carved them into the wall. They said it the still water hymn. Every shift since, or descending into the earth, someone would hum that tune, low, steady, reminding them that no gold could outshine peace. Luke didn't hear about it till years later, when a young prospector stopped him on a dirt road and said, "You're the man who wrote that song that keeps us sane underground." Luke chuckled. "Didn't write it, son. Just remembered it for a while." Spent his later years wandering the back roads of America, singing by campfires in town squares, sometimes for coins, sometimes sets for the echo. He refused aught deals, turned down fame, and slept beneath the stars more often than Ruth. To him, money was only worth what it could buy in silence, and silence came cheap out there beneath the open sky. One rainy night, he found himself at a train station on the edge of nowhere, one of those places built for travelers who never came. The benches were empty, the clock frozen, but there was a small cafe tucked in the corner. The sign above it read The Crossing. Luke stopped cold. The paint was faded, the door warped, but the name sent a tremor through him like deja vu. He stepped inside, and there it was, the smell of old wood, the hum of rain, and a compass hanging crooked above the counter. He sat down at the same kind of table Mains Holt once leaned over a century before. His hands trembled as he set down his guitar and whispered, "So this is how it started." Behind the counter, an old woman lit up from her ledger. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what he wanted. She just smiled and said, "You look tired, traveler. Coffee?" He nodded, and she poured it without another word. After a long silence, Luke spoke. "Funny thing, finding this place. My teacher once told it about a cafe called The Crossing. Didn't think it was real." "Oh, it's real," she said softly. "Always has been, though it don't show up for everyone. Only for those who remember what they forgot." He chuckled under his breath. "Reckon I've been remembering my whole life." She studied him for a while, then nodded toward the old compass. "It don't mind north, you know. It points to stillness. Same thing you've been singing about." Luke smiled. "Then I've been following it without knowing. They talked to Don about Holt and Reed, Clara and Eli, all the souls who'd come and gone through that same door, each leaving something behind. When the first light broke through the rain, Luke took out a folded page from his pocket, the one Eli had written all those years old." She leered across the table. "The world forgets stillness. Sing it back to M." She read it slow, eyes glistening. "You done that, haven't you?" He shrugged. "Maybe, but it ain't mine anymore." Luke left the page there along with his guitar. Then he walked outside into the mist, hat pulled low, boots splashing through puddles. A freight train roared by, wind whipping his coat, but he didn't look back. They say the woman kept that guitar behind the counter for years, strings a little dusty but still in tune. And every so often, a traveler would stop in asking if they could play a song. She'd nod, and they'd sit right that Luke once did, strum a few chords and hum the tune that had outlived its maker. Some said if you listened close enough, you could still hear his voice blending with the rain, low and easy, saying, "Don't follow the noise, partner, follow the pause between it. That with the truth lives." And maybe that's how all stories end, the good ones anyway, not with a shout, but with a whisper carried on wind and water, reaching whoever needs it most. The cafe never closed again. Some nights it glowed brighter than the town now did, like a lantern for the lost. And above the door, that old compass hung steady, pointing nowhere, pointing home. Luke never found another place quite like the crossing, but the memory of it followed him like the scent of rain on dry dirt. Wherever he wandered, folks said the air felt calmer when he showed up, like storms paused, just listened. And when he left, they swore the world seemed to hum softer for a while, like it had remembered something it forgot. He spent his final years in a quiet town called Hollow Bend, tucked between rolling hills and the kind of river that let silver under moonlight. Nobody knew who he was at first. He introduced himself simply as Luke, the fella who trades songs for supper. He rented a one-room shack near the old railway and fixed it up with his own hands. The floor creaked, the roof leaked. But he said it was perfect, a house that breathes. Every evening he'd sit on the porch with his battered guitar and play for whoever passed. Sometimes it was a farmer heading home late, sometimes a group of kids chasing fireflies. But no matter who it was, he'd tip his hat and say, "Don't cost nothing to listen." One of those listeners was a young woman named June Miller, a local librarian with a quiet heart and a head full of dreams bigger than her paycheck. She'd stop by after closing the library just to listen in the dark. After a while, she started bringing coffee and questions. "What did you do before all this?" she asked one night, when the stars were clear as glass. Luke smiled slow. "I tried to get rich. Turns out it's harder than singing." She laughed, thinking he was joking, but his eyes had that faraway shine, the look of a man who'd met every version of himself and learned which ones weren't worth keeping. He told her about the Ledger House, about Eli and the compass, about the crossing and the old souls who taught him how to stand still. June listened like it was gospel. "Do you wish you'd kept the place?" she asked one night, when the stars were clear as glass. Luke smiled slow. "I tried to get rich. Turns out it's harder than singing." She laughed, thinking he was joking, but his eyes had that faraway shine, the look of a man who'd met every version of himself and learned which ones weren't worth keeping. He told her about the Ledger House, about Eli and the compass, about the crossing and the old souls who taught him how to stand still. June listened like it was gospel. "Do you wish you'd kept the place?" she asked one night, when the stars were clear as glass. Luke smiled slow, quietly, naturally, as you sleep. "It'll where you live," she started writing down his stories in a leather-bound journal, each one more unbelievable than the last. But did the pages fill? She began to realize they weren't fairy tales. They were blueprints. He taught her about money without mentioning a thin number. "Earn slow, save deep, and never let a dollar talk louder than your heart," he'd say. He showed her how to turn her small paycheck into a seed, not by investing in stocks or schemes, but in herself. "Buy time, June," he said. "That's the only thing that pays you back in silence." She started a small reading group for the townsfolk, called it Stillwater Evenings. Folks there after work to read by lantern light, talk about dreams, and sometimes just sit in companionable quiet. Soon enough, Hollow Bend began to change. The hardware store owners started hosting potlucks instead of sales. The mechanics stopped charging widows for tune-ups. A retired banker started teaching kids about compound interest, not that math, but at patience. The town began running on a different kind of currency. One summer, June came by Luke's porch and found him staring at the horizon. His hand shook, his breath short. "You awake?" she asked. He smiled weakly. "Just running out of strings, sweetheart. But I reckon the tune's still playing somewhere." That night, he handed her a folded page, old, worn, but legible. It was from the Ledger. "If the road lead nowhere, make that your destination." June didn't cry till after he was gone. She buried him by the river, under a crooked willow that leaned like it was listening. The townsfolk carved a stone that read, "Luke heard the man who sang stillness into sound." In time, June turned Stillwater Evenings into a full-fledged center, not for business, not for religion, but for teaching what Luke had lived, the harmony between work and wonder. People from miles around came to learn how to live quieter, earn wiser, and give with both hands open. There was a rule written over the door: leave richer than you arrived, even if your pockets stay empty. Decades later, a film crew stumbled upon Hollow Bend. They were making a documentary on forgotten American towns. What they found wasn't decay, it was peace. No billboards, no debt collectors, no chain stores. Just people who knew their neighbors and smiled like they meant it. The director asked June, now gray-haired but sharp-eyed, how it had started. She led him to a small shelf in the library. On it sat Luke's guitar, the ledger and the compass, polished but never used. She opened the ledger to the last page, written in her hand. Stillness is not the end of ambition, it's the root that lets it grow honest. The crew filmed her reading it aloud, her voice soft but steady. When they aired the documentary months later, the world couldn't believe what they saw, a town that measured wealth and warmth. People started driving out there, trying to find Hollow Bend. Some did, most didn't, but the story spread like seed in the wind. It's somewhere, maybe in a diner off a lonely highway or a coffee shop in a rain-washed city, a traveler would stop mid-sip, glance at the compass they kept on their keychain and feel it tremble, not toward north, but toward home. Maybe the crossing was gone. Maybe Stillwater Hall had rotted away. Maybe the ledger ink had finally faded. But the message, whispered through the years by rough hands and quiet hearts, remained clear in a desert sky. You can't own peace. You can pass it along. And under the same stars that watched Holt, Clara, Eli, and Luke, someone new would pause, smile, and start reading the next verse of the same old truth, that wealth ain't gold and time ain't debt, and the sound of rain on a tin roof is payment enough for a life well lived. Years after June passed, the world beyond Hollow Bend had spun itself dizzy again. Skyscrapers replaced steeples, silence turned into static, and folks traded patience for speed like it was progress. But out in the hills, that the river still bent silver under the moon, there was a boy who couldn't sleep without the sound of the wind rustling through old willows. His name was Amos, and he grew up listening to his granddad tell stories about a man who sang peace into the world. Granddad said Luke Curd wasn't no ordinary drifter. He was a keeper of stillness, a rare kind of soul who could make even time take a breath. Amos didn't know what that meant back then, but he felt it in the quiet between the cricket song and the crackle of the fire. One summer, when Amos turned 16, he found an old leather case buried in the shed behind their house. Inside was a guitar, strings rusted, wood cracked, initials LC carved into the neck. Alongside it, a folded map drawn by hand, leaden from Hollow Bend down to a place marked only with a star and 3 words, follow the river. Amos didn't ask permission. He packed a small bag, slung the guitar over his back, and set out at dawn. The road was long, the dust thick, but the boy walked like he'd been called by something older than time. Along the way, he met folks who told him the same story in different tongues about a cafe that appeared in storms, a hall that taught patience, a ledger that carried every name of those who'd found stillness. Some thought it myth, others swore it was real. 3 weeks into his journey, Amos reached a place with the river slowed to a whisper. There wasn't much left of it, though man shook his spears. And then the skeleton of an old build with the faintest letters still carved above the door, the crossing. He stood there a long while, rain trickling down his coat, the sound soft to memory. Then something strange happened. The compass on his necklace, one his granddad said never pointed north, began to spin. It whirled, then stopped dead still, coating toward the open doorway. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of cedar long faded. But in the far corner, under a window half covered with ivy, lay a silk chair and a ledger. Amos knelt beside it. The leather was worn smooth from hands he'd never know. He opened the cover, and the first page read, "The measure of a life is not what it earns, but what it steadies." He flipped through, reading the names: Mason Holt, Clara Vance, Eli Booker, Luke Cade, June Miller, and now blank lines waiting at the end at open arms. He pulled a pen from his pocket, just a cheap one, half-dried, and wrote his name. Then he added, "Found the still part of the stream outside. Thunder rolled low. The boy didn't flinch. He sat there through the night, strumming that old guitar till the strings stopped protesting. The sound was not perfect. It cracked, buzzed, wandered, but there was truth in it. When morning came, a traveler passing through stopped by the river and heard the faint music floating from the ruins. The sound was so steady, so alive, he thought it was a whole band playing. But when he stepped closer, there was old Amos, eyes closed, humming like the river itself had a voice. 'Boy,' the traveler said, 'that tune yours.' Amos smiled without opening his eyes. "No, sir, just borrowing it for a while." The traveler nodded slow, then left him be. Word spread, it always does when truth meets wonder. Before long, strangers started visiting the ruins, leaving notes, carvings, or small offerings on the old stone table by the door. Coins, flowers, handwritten promises to slow down and listen more. Someone painted the words "Stillwater lives" on the wall in faded blue. By the time Amos turned 25, he'd built a small shelter near the site, not a cafe, not a school, but a place for anyone who needed to stop running. Folks called it the listening post. He didn't charge money, didn't sell nothing. He'd only ask one question to everyone who came through: "Are you hurrying toward that won't wait for you?" They laughed and cried, so left and came back years later with answers. And when the world got too loud, when wars broke out, when markets crashed, when the noise reached even the hills, people started writing to the listening post. Letters from all over addressed only to Stillwater, CO, the river. Amos read every one. He kept them in boxes under the tape, dyed with twine, labeled by the kind of ache they carried. Lost time, missed chances, quiet found, and that decked the ledger before it. Those letters became a map, a record of people who'd paused long enough to remember themselves. One cold autumn, a journalist came to write about the place. She asked Amos what it was for, the letters, the stories, the endless sitting and listening. Looked out toward the water and said, "The world real good at teaching us how to earn. I reckon somebody ought to teach it how to rest." She smiled. "You think it'll listen?" He plucked one soft note on the guitar, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the river. Eventually, he said, "The river always finds its way back to still." When Amos died years later, they buried him beside that river under the same bellow that once watched over Luke. His guitar rested on the bay, strings gleaming in the morning light. Not long after, when the rains came harder than usual, travelers said they could hear two voices in the wind, one deep and slow, one young and bright, humming together across the valley. Nobody rebuilt the crossing. Nobody had to. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a rhythm carried in hearts, whispered in rain, passed down by those who understood the simplest wealth that souls could hold. The power to sit still and let the world breathe again.